everyone to the SPJ board meeting of February 1, 2020. Appreciate folks being here with us. We have a long agenda. We'll try to move with speed but thoroughness and make sure that everyone who wants to participate can participate. So, Madam Secretary Treasurer, would you please read the roll?
Yes, good morning, Patty. Here's a roll call and Happy New Year, everybody. Patty Newberry.
Is here.
Matt Hall.
Here.
Rebecca Aguilar. Here. Lauren Bartlett.
Here.
Yvette Walker. Mike Riley.
Here.
Erica Carvajal. Tess Fox.
Here.
Taylor, forgive me if I mispronounce your last name. Taylor Murfadensky?
Here.
Do I have that right, Taylor?
Mirfendereski. That was very close.
Murfadensky. Okay, I will get it down. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Excuse me, did Yvette Walker join us?
She is absent today for a family emergency.
All right, thank you.
Did we finish the roll?
Yes. Oh, Tess Fox? I did say Tess Fox, right? Yes.
Yes, I'm here.
Mike Riley.
I have my list.
And Mike Riley is here.
I'm here, yeah.
All right, super. Thank you, everyone. And welcome. Likewise, Happy New Year to all. Appreciate folks being here. If everyone can see, of course, we have other folks with us on the call. And we'll just want to let everyone know that we will have a public comment session. It's number 11 on the agenda. Depending on how many people want to speak, when we get to that, we may have to impose some limits of 2 minutes or 3 minutes, but we'll see how many people actually want to speak when we are there. All right. The first item on the agenda is number 3, our minutes from meetings of October 19th, 2019 and November 3rd, 2019. Those begin right after the first pages of the agenda and go on for several pages. Do we have any, do we have a motion on acceptance of the minutes?
This is Lauren. I move to approve the minutes.
Very good. Do we have a second on approval of both minutes? I need a second on approval of the minutes, please. Any board? Thank you, Matt Hall. And now, any discussion on the minutes? Lauren,
I have a few corrections.
Thank you very much.
On page 6, in the second paragraph, it should be changed from Bartlett confirmed the trust issue brought forward by 2 board members to Bartlett raised the trust issue brought forward by 2 board members. And on page 9, under contest awards, we should correct Sue's name to Sue Copen-Katzif. And then on the November 3rd board minutes on page 11, please change, she does believe the candidate interviewed today will do a good job, but because of such a flawed process, she can't support the process, to she does believe the candidate interviewed today will do a good job, but because of such a flawed process, she can't support the motion because of the process.
Thank you very much. Any other comment on the minutes?
I think Andy Schatz had sent some corrections via email. Are those incorporated?
Andy, would you like to articulate your corrections? Offer them verbally? You're still muted.
Hold on, let me find them. Go ahead if anybody has any other things.
All right.
I would just say there's one minor thing on page 9. There's a reference to me that's Matt. We can just change that to Hall for consistency.
Great.
The editor and me would appreciate it.
So Lauren had already submitted her corrections via email. We'll make sure that those that the record is corrected in those points. Andy Schott, had you submitted yours via email as well?
I did. I sent them to you and to Matt. I have them here now. They were mostly just some names that were misspelled. Mike Riley's name, Yvette Davila Richard's name. But there was one mention of the new awards categories. I wanted to clarify there are 3 new SDX categories.
What page is that, please, for clarity?
If
If it's in the email you sent me, don't worry, we'll capture it.
It is.
Okay.
I also I had a question, and maybe this is just my memory. Did we really have 300 candidates for the executive director search?
That is what Talbot Talent told us. We didn't have, we the selection committee did not see 300 resumes.
Okay.
But their process, they put the application in front of 300, what they considered 300 viable candidates who were a good match with the job description.
Okay, that's everything for me.
So thank you very much. Any other discussion on the minutes? Seeing none, are we ready, board, to vote on the motion on the table to approve the minutes for those 2 last meetings? All those in favor by voice vote, please say aye.
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 Do we have any opposed? Do we have any abstentions? The motion carries, and we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the president's report. If you have your packet open in front of you, that begins on page 13. I don't have anything additional for the report. It's simply an update on how I've been spending my time on behalf of SPJ. The only thing I'll say is, of the 5 high school or middle school students that I invited to be kind of honorary SPJ members, 2 took me up on it. So I guess I owe headquarters $37.50, or maybe I can use the discount that's in place as of today and I can get them for $25 each. So I'll follow up with the remaining students. One of them, you might recall, is already an SPJ member, and she and 4 other young people were featured in last Sunday's New York Times in a story on younger folks doing good journalism. Any questions or reactions to my report? Seeing none, we'll move on to our executive director. Welcome, John Schertzer. His report begins on page 15. And John, we'd welcome you to say a few words, overview on your report.
Thank you, Patty. Hello, everyone. Glad to be a part of this very first board meeting for myself. So the report, I think I won't really elaborate too much on anything that's there, since it's was pretty timely, and nothing has shifted in one way or another really from the things that are mentioned in that report. I'd say overall it's been a very smooth and easy transition into this role. Simply the day-to-day work, the dealings with staff and volunteers and members has been enjoyable. It's been inspiring. It's been, it's not without challenges, of course, and we've got those to deal with as we move along in today's meeting, but also the history of the organization as it proceeds on. But I feel really good about at least how I've been brought into the organization, and I feel excited about what lies ahead. So if you have any questions about any of the details that are in here, I'd be glad to answer those for you.
Very good. Thanks so much, John. Lauren, for a question, please.
Just wanted to raise 2 things, because I know there's several RCs on the call, on the meeting, and I know that they're interested in this. If you could touch a little bit and just provide as much details as available about where we stand on the database issue. And then if you could also just share what a timeline is for developing the leadership and chapter training, so they're more familiar with what's going on.
Sure. On the database issue, we are in a moment right now where we're dealing with 3 different entities in a way. We have our current vendor. We have a vendor that we'd like to do more investigation on and feel pretty excited about. And then we have a vendor that we started this journey with last year and have who they feel, and from their perspective, feel we still have an agreement with. So we are trying to deal with all 3 of those things at once. I would say that as of today, we are still dealing with all that, and there's no, I can't announce today that we're going to one system or another, but we certainly want to make sure that's all clarified by the time we get to April's board meeting. And that's, I think, still a good timeline. I'd like to make decisions prior to that, but as far as reporting and sharing or getting support from the board be ready in April to announce that. I've seen it firsthand how the limitations of our current system, so it's made me want to move even more aggressively towards a new solution, and hopefully we'll get there very quickly. On your other question, timeline, I don't have a timeline. We do have, as far as training is concerned in regards to regional or chapter training and education, we do have an event that we're planning, the Scripps Leadership Boot Camp, which is going to be held in June, and it's for college members to attend and get some training and education and how to be best in their roles as far as leading newsrooms, leading their organizations, and just general leadership as well. And then I've had several conversations with staff and volunteers about what we would try to develop and what we could think about developing for training beyond that for chapter leaders within the organization as well as others. So I don't have a timeline or any sort of plan set forth on that, just some investigation at this point. I would say I've been invited to attend a couple of regional meetings in April, and I'm excited to go to those so I can experience what that activity looks like so that I can bring some thinking to bear on how we might support regions and chapters in that way.
Sorry, Matt Hall, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Lauren actually touched on the two subjects I was most interested in, and I just had a couple follow-up questions. So if the board in April gets a recommendation on which vendor to pursue, brass tacks, what does that mean in terms of implementing a database and solving some pretty horrendous problems that a lot of chapters have some legitimate concerns about?
Sure, that's based on vendor, right? So if we, as far as I can see from the proposals that have been delivered, the vendor that we had an agreement in place with last year, if we were to hit go on that one and really go full speed ahead, I will work with them to be more aggressive in their timeline, but it seems like that would be a 6 to 9 month transition period. The newer vendor could be around that frame, but I think they would move a little more rapidly simply because I just have more confidence that they could just simply by what they shared with us. So I think it would be fantastic, Matt, if at EIJ 20, we could highlight and showcase what a new system could look like to the member. And it may not be all completely at the finish line at that point, but we'd be pretty close at that point, I would hope. And that would involve, and I think expect that we would have to do some initial groundwork pretty soon, but I think we can get there.
And I think given the staff turnover and you being new to the position, and resetting this, I think by year's end is reasonable to expect chapters and board members to kind of be okay with that. But I would just at an early stage say, if we're still talking about this database in 2021, that's going to be a nightmare for a lot of reasons. So I just want to put that on the record. I know you're working hard and I appreciate that. And then the other, I'm really excited about these training programs. A couple quick questions about the student leadership training program. I'm wondering what the frequency will be if we're bringing a dozen or 14 students in to Indy in April. So what's the frequency? How many are we gonna do a year, or what's the repeat performance? And then are we looking to keep that scope the same, that number of students, or could that grow? And my third question is on the location. Will it always be in Indy, or will we try to cycle through parts of the country?
Yeah, so just actually so this is still coming together. So it's something that as soon as I got on board here, it seems that some pieces were in place, but they were very tentative. And so we're starting to get more structure put around this. It is going to be 14 students. It'll be held in June, the end of, looks like middle June, in Cincinnati at the Scripps Howard location. Frequency, right now we're looking at a once a year. I mean, this would be the only one for 2020. I think depending on the success of that, and if the Scripps Foundation is excited about it and we can find a way to do more, I think that would be, of course, preferable, as well as to increase attendance in some way or another. So if we do multiple sessions of 14, or if we find out we could do more in a particular session. The goal is to get the students there to provide a couple of days of training for them. And then they will be brought back to EIJ for continued discussions, as well as to also get a chance for them to meet SPJ members, although many of them likely will be already SPJ members just at the collegiate level. And then do an additional day's worth of site visits in Washington, D.C. And then another part of the program is that they'll be assigned a mentor, each of them, from SPJ, that will be in their local area that they can develop some relationship with, and some mentoring. So that's all the way it's sort of being laid out at this point. And we're going to start recruiting for the participants within a matter of 2 weeks or so. We just had some conversations yesterday, as a matter of fact, about the timeline for that.
That all sounds fantastic. Thank you very much for doing that. And I'm really glad that we are including a mentorship component to keep them involved with the organization, because I know that Rebecca has done some amazing things with the diversity committee and keeping them kind of continually involved and being ambassadors for SPJ. And I think, you know, before that, there wasn't a lot of connectivity there. And so I think that link is going to be super important.
Good.
Thank you.
It's one, just to add to that, it's one thing among many that I feel somewhat that I need to live through and experience in order to really have a sense of how to best influence it from my experience and things I can bring. Although since it is somewhat of a new focus, this one is getting a little bit more of my attention from the outset. But there's some things that I feel is good for me just to kind of see it through, and then we'll be able to make some strong adjustments after.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Other questions or comments on anything else in John's report? I would just note that Scripps Howard has been a longtime supporter of SPJ, and up until this new iteration, their annual dollars have gone to training of chapter leaders. I don't know how many years back that program dates, but it was a well-attended and well-executed program. And we do now have a hole in our lineup of possibilities for leaders, because we don't because Scripps Howard would like to use its contribution in a different way, and certainly they have that prerogative. But in terms of training our existing chapter leaders and regional coordinators and so forth, we are going to have to figure out a way to do that with existing funds, unless, you know, a new funder is brought in for that possibility. All right, so thank you to John so much for his rapid leap out of the gate here. He's been with us since December 2, putting a lot of great energy toward all tasks, and a really quick study, in my estimation, of the many, many moving parts of SPJ. So thanks to him, and thanks to staff for great support of his onboarding. And I was remiss in not thanking staff for being part of this meeting today on a Saturday. All right, let's move to the next item on the agenda, and that's going to page 19. And Matt Hall will take the microphone here. This is an update on our strategic planning task force. Matt has a report and a lot of supporting data, and I'll let him give an overview. Again, page 19, if you have your packet up.
Yeah, hey y'all, I'm looking forward to taking your questions, and a lot of this information is there for you all to kind of peruse, but just I'll hit the high notes. The strategic task force did amazing work under Victor's guidance for 6 months, first 6 months of the year, and since EIJ. When I took it over, we've met several times, first to plan and then hold these 3 focus groups, which were, I think, pretty useful. You'll see all sorts of data which you can carve into at your leisure. You might want to start with that slideshow, which really kind of hits the highlights about what student members, pro chapter members, and then others, including postgrads, told us about what they think we do well, what we do poorly, and what we should do going forward. And that's kind of where we're at now. The task force met, I guess it was last week or 2 weeks ago, to discuss what our possible game plan is going forward to get a 2 to 3 page report to the board in April. And what we've done is we've created 5 themes under which we're going to kind of take deep dives and get into the details and figure out some really good strategic ways for us to move the organization and really the industry forward. And I'm pretty excited about that. Our plan is to meet several times between now and early April and really flesh those 5 things out. Everyone is invited if they want to come and listen in on those sessions. I know Lauren has been in on several, and Sue joined us at the last one, and that was pretty great to have some interest in that, because I do think it's an important process. And now I'm going to shut up and take any questions that anyone has.
So Matt, for the sake of folks who maybe haven't read the memo in full, just give a quick top line summary that the task force at this point is looking at 5 priorities. If you could just quickly hit on why we chose those.
Yeah, sure. And so that was a pretty, I'd even say, scientific process, right? We took all of the information from the focus groups, which ended up with my, whatever it was, page report, and then the crystallization in that slideshow. And each member then ranked which items that they wanted to prioritize, right? So we ranked those in a 1 through 5 manner. And I'm trying to get to the report now to see. There was general consensus, I'd say, among the board on the 5 subjects. In general, we wanted the focus to be on membership, right? We wanted it to reflect diversity, because these are all important components of SPJ in the past. But we also wanted to focus on education and training, importantly with a focus on innovation. That's one of the things that Victor and Mike have been stressing, is that we really need to be forward thinking as we proceed here. And obviously advocacy, lobbying, ethics, and FOI, all of which are individually important, but kind of collectively we lumped into one theme, because they all kind of put us at the forefront, at the vanguard of some important aspects of the industry. And I think, unlike membership and education and diversity, which every journalism organization prides itself on and aims to excel in, that advocacy, lobbying, ethics, and FOI are really areas where SPJ can really stand out. And so I'm really excited for that conversation. And then the 5th theme is financial growth and stability, which anyone who's looked at our budgets in the last couple of years and been frustrated by our deficit position can I think, appreciate that we want to turn that ship around and have a strong organization. And a lot of that financial growth will depend on the other themes, right? So a lot of these are interwoven. Financial growth depends on membership, and it depends on having a strong, diverse, and inclusive group of journalists at SPJ. And it depends on the work we do, both for journalists and then on behalf of journalists. So I think that these 5 themes, there was high consensus on these. And so I'm curious to see if what others think about those 5 themes.
Right. Do we have any comments from board members? Lauren Bartlett, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Patty. There's 2 different areas that I wanted to touch on. First of all, I just want to commend the work of the task force. I think they're doing a really great job. But deciding what SPJ's future should be is really, really important and vital. And I think that's something that should be discussed by the entire board prior to the completed plan being brought to us in EIJ. So I'm suggesting that we schedule a Zoom meeting in July solely devoted to the strategic plan. That way, a lot of the work will be built out. It'll give the board and all members a chance to weigh in and listen, and it'll give the strategic planning task force time to go back and make adjustments and tweaks prior to a full vote at EIJ. So I'd like to ask everybody to consider that. And secondly, And taking a look at the themes, there seem to be on two different tracks. One is internal operational priorities, and other is external, what we say SPJ stands for, what's our elevator speech, what's our value proposition. And I think going forward, it would be helpful if we clearly label these and separate them out through the planning process. And in terms of what our external focus is, I'm very concerned about grouping advocacy, lobbying, ethics, and freedom of information all into one bucket. Right now, two of those are our current pillars. We have diversity, FOI, and ethics as the current pillars of the organization. I think that lobbying is a subset of advocacy, but then we also have the training and professional development bucket. And so one of the things that also ask people to think about, and Victor brought this up at the spring meeting last year, is are we trying to do too much? Right now, I think our greatest strength is our greatest weakness, which is what I also said at that board meeting. We try to be everything to everybody, and we're not going to be able to succeed if we continue on that path. And I know that that's not the goal of the task force, but I would ask the task force to consider when they're going through these things and really analyzing them, to think about how many things we reasonably can achieve moving forward as being who we are and what we stand for.
Thank you, Lauren. Other comments? So just to respond to that, I would say that the plan of the task force, so far as I am recalling, Matt, was to have something on paper for the April board meeting, and that we build into the agenda for the April board meeting really kind of a workshop feel for some portion of the agenda. So we're not just, the task force isn't simply presenting a plan that's locked in, but presenting a working document, right? We can quibble on the right language here, but I think there'll be plenty of time for the board to participate in full. We absolutely need the whole board to buy into whatever plan we want to go forward with. And I would also say, you know, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that we have here, yeah, it's still a little bit messy, right? You were on the call. We had a lot of conversation about how many and which words capture, etc. So it's still a work in progress. The good news is lots of members spoke out, participated, put their voice forward, and that's great. We have a lot of data to go back to. And the other thing I've said several times is, remember, a strategic plan is a living, breathing document. Whatever we put in place, whether we adopt it in April, adopt it at EIJ, it's going to be, I think it should be a document that we come back to on an annual basis and say, are these still our top priorities? Did we accomplish these things? Do we need to refine our short-term and our longer-term goals? So we still have a lot of work to do, but really do think that we've made some good progress. And at some point we do have to, you know, put something on paper and get a thumbs up or a thumbs down on it so that we have a working document and we start to move forward on whatever we say our short and long-term priorities are.
Thanks, Patty. I have one question I forgot to ask. It's for the task force. We have a lot of information that we've gathered from members and former members, but I know one of our goals is to go out there and get people to join SPJ who have never been a part of the organization before. What kind of efforts, or do we have any efforts, and if we don't, could we try to find a way to have outreach to them to get their input, to find out what it would take for them to join and what might, you know, make us interesting to them, because I know that we want to expand our membership.
Mm-hmm. That's a compelling question. I'm not sure how we'd get at that. So thank you for that suggestion. Anybody have any reaction to that? How do we find out what would motivate non-members to become members?
Our next committee meeting, we're actually discussing membership. I think that will probably be covered there.
Good. Rebecca, you had your hand up?
Yes, I think sometimes just reaching out to different journalism groups. I mean, every group has a Facebook page. I would ask if you're not, like, I could definitely go to NHJ and say, hey, I'm part of SPJ and NHJ. Is there a reason why you guys haven't joined SPJ? I mean, if you're a member of another group, you're allowed to talk about it on a Facebook group page. Just be that open. And some people will start sharing. I think it's that simple.
I think that's a very good suggestion. And in your inboxes yesterday, you received information about our February membership drive and the SPJ Love campaign, which will be on February 14th. So that's a really good opportunity to put that in front of your friends in your news organization, your friends in other media advocacy groups, anywhere you can, determine that we might have some willing folks.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think as board members, I'm glad that Lauren brought this up, because I think as board members, we should all be doing this every day, just in the course of business, is trying to ask people who aren't members why they're not, what they'd like to see. And then, I mean, that's kind of what being a board member is all about, and so the task force definitely is going to discuss this at its next meeting when it jumps into the membership discussion and takes a deep dive. But I would encourage everyone to kind of take those steps day to day as well.
And if I could read Bob Becker's comment in chat, because I think it's a good point. There are many people who do journalism but are not members of any journalism group. We need to find ways to reach them.
And can I jump in here real quick?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
One of the things that is important is, yes, definitely on Facebook, find those groups, but back to this campaign that we're going to do on Valentine's Day. I made sure that our diversity fellows are all going to be tweeting that day too. So, and get, their circle, most of them are, like 30 and under, to get, more support behind SPJ. And also in groups, like I have a group on Facebook called Latinas in Journalism. It's more than 2,000 women. I'll go on there today and ask them, why aren't you guys part of SPJ? Let's see what they have to say. Because again, as Matt has done well in including in this whole conversation is diversity. And so obviously as someone that is from a diverse background, I do have an obligation in that area. So Matt, nice job on all this too.
Thank you.
All right, very good. Other questions for Matt or about the task force? At this point, does any board member feel that there's a motion to be had on Matt's task force report? Or are we simply accepting it as a report and moving forward?
Yeah, I would suggest I don't know. And if anyone wants to take action, by all means, they should suggest it, but I don't think there's anything necessary. We're going to come back in April with a lot more to discuss. And I'm glad to hear you, Patty, say that there will be a deep discussion about that, because I think the board needs to discuss this and should do it sooner rather than later. So that's great.
Right. It would be my goal after April to actually have a document that we agree on. Right. So I think I would hope that the task force can bring a draft of a strategic plan, and we'll devote significant time during that weekend to try to come to an agreement.
Patty, I just wanted to get clarity on process, because Matt's report says that the task force will be bringing something to the board in April, but also expects to bring the final product to EIJ in September. So I'm a little bit confused on what comes in April and what comes in.
And maybe John can
clarify that, Matt?
Yeah, maybe John can speak to that. Our plan was to bring something to the board, but then staff is going to ultimately have to implement this. So there's another layer, a deeper layer, where staff's input and involvement will be necessary to implement the board's kind of high level planning.
Okay, so I guess the only thing I would have to say is there's not a whole lot of time between now and April. So I want to share one of my favorite John Wooden quotes. Be quick, but don't hurry.
I would hope that we can come away from the weekend in April with a plan that John says, yes, this is doable. This is a realistic way to move forward for the next 6 months. I don't see trying to prolong the creation of a plan until the fall, because
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting if we don't finish it in April because we need more time, that we take more time and have another meeting in May.
right.
That we wait
Right.
in September.
Yeah, okay. Any other thoughts? Welcome to Yvette Walker, who's joining us. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Sorry, I've been traveling. I just came back from a funeral.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here, and condolences on your loss. All right, if we have no further discussion on that agenda point, we will move to number 7, which is an update on the EIJ Sponsorship Task Force. That begins on page 72 in your packet. And we do have with us the chair of that task force, Narissa Young, from Ohio University. And I would ask Narissa to join us if she can open her mic and give us a verbal overview of her group's work. Hi, Narissa, not hearing you. It doesn't, you don't appear to be muted. Now you're muted. Jennifer, if you're on the call, can you assist at all in unmuting Narissa Young?
She's unmuted, so I think it might be something with her settings.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay. If I get some feedback, I'm sorry. I'm on the phone.
Well, we're seeing you.
All right, thanks. Thank you all for giving us some time today. My original hope was to have this done by April 1, but thanks to the quick work of my colleagues on the committee, the task force, we were able to get something to you today. Matt and Andy are on this call, so if I misrepresent something, I would appreciate them correcting me. Also want to thank Larry Messing and Jennifer Royer for staff support to get us information. We also did a survey, as you can see from the memo, but for those who are on the call who do not have access to the board packet, the results were not statistically significant in terms of response rate. However, we think there's some good information there that Becky Talent, appreciate her condensing that and summarizing it into the slides for your information. We recognize the calendar that was put in the resolution, May 1, that this should go out to members for comment and then come back for delegate vote in DC at EIJ 20. A couple of our concerns are that we thought that SPJ's mission should be incorporated into this to keep us mindful that the sponsors that we are seeking are in concert with the goals and desires of the organization have been identified in that mission statement. Also, I think there is a bit of a trust issue that perhaps sometimes sponsors are being sought in which SPJ is sort of giving up its ideals to maintain relationships with other groups. We don't want to exclude anyone, and that's why the draft proposal says media and non-media, but we do want to make sure these people are enhancing SPJ's mission and reputation. And we certainly hope the board will look at exploring relationships with other organizations, not to say we haven't enjoyed the opportunities we've had with folks we've collaborated with before. If we can continue to do that, I think that's a great thing, but also invite others into the tent, especially in terms of other journalism organizations that are listed in a lot of that raw data. I'll take questions as best I can and appreciate the opportunity. And John, the photo announcing you're coming showed you with a lot of blonde hair, and I'm seeing a lot of gray today, so SPJ must be really hard on you.
I got 3 boys at home, so it's coming both directions.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Narissa. Do we have questions about the task force's work or recommendations?
Mike Riley, I've got some comments on it. It's very broad. And when I read some of these things here, you know, any organization that could do harm to a journalist, we should not be doing work with. And let me give you an example. Let's say the Facebook program. Somebody comes forth and says, well, Facebook does harm to journalists because it allows disinformation to be spread, and that harms journalists. Then we toss them aside as a partner. And I remember right, this initial sponsorship policy was to be drawn up for EIJ. That was the initial task we put forth. But what we have in front of us here is what's good for one is good for all, and it extends beyond that. I'm wondering if it has extended a little too far.
Thanks, Mike. That's a great question, and one that we had a lot of discussion about. Our concern is, and it's certainly the board's prerogative to do as it chooses, but that we should be consistent on all fronts for several reasons. One, if there is not a lot of guidance, that puts SPJ staff in the crosshairs because they're trying to carry out things on one hand and then getting criticized for doing it on the other if there's not a consistent policy throughout. And our thought was in incorporating parts of the mission into it was to keep those things at the forefront, that if we're seeing action by organizations, we're not suggesting that Facebook or Google be terminated, but if this should be approved moving forward, we would certainly want those considerations as part of it. It is still pretty open-ended in terms of who can be approached, who can approach us in terms of asking about things. But if we're advocating for journalists and journalism and taking money or entering into collaborative agreements with those who are specifically targeting journalism and journalists, we're our own worst enemy in those kinds of people.
As phrased, I can't support the policy based on the fact that it rules out, you know, dozens upon dozens of great partners because somebody can misinterpret it. How we enforce these policies is key. It's the same way with our policy at EIJ we had last year on conduct. You know, how is it enforced and who's enforcing it, and is it randomly enforced and not enforced over here or over there? You know, it was just a complete mess. The same thing, I see the same thing developing here. All I heard from board members last fall was, Mike, you're at ONA. Why do they have so many great partners and vendors there and we don't? Well, part of it is they don't want to work with us, or the ones that we do have working with us maybe don't think we're great partners anymore. And passing a policy like this is setting up a big red flag to a lot of organizations. We don't want to work with you. We think you might be harming journalists. And like I say, it's too broad. The policy can be taken and just thrown in the lap of, you know, somebody raises, you know, an issue with one of these, partnerships that we have and great training programs that we have. And, you know, here we go. We are walling ourselves off again. And that's the problem SPJ has right now. We're walling ourselves off from great partnerships, and we've got a reputation of not being a good partner on things.
Just for a historical note, I certainly appreciate your concerns, Mike. Most of this was drafted from ONA's policy, which referred to and was drafted from a previous SPJ sponsorship policy. So one we had earlier that went the wayside, they liked and they took in.
But Narissa, you're missing my point. We can be recopying ourselves over and over, but we put this out here as phrased, and all of a sudden, you know, somebody's taking it within the organization. All you need is, you know, a few people on a board or a committee to all of a sudden start freaking out about something that they don't like, and they take and abuse the policy. That's what I'm saying. ONA apparently doesn't. I read the memo. I know where it originated from, but you know, I don't need to have that explained to me. What I'm saying is it can be misused as phrased. So I think they need to do a little more work on it before this board can support it. That's all I have to say.
Before we move forward, Narissa, I just want some clarity here on the memo that you have drafted. Are you asking for the board to do anything today in advance of this suggested new policy going to the delegates this fall?
No, not necessarily. Our charge was to put something before the board, and we wanted to make sure that we got it to the board no later than April, so that whatever you needed to do gave the board an ample time window to get it in front of the membership for their comments and feedback by about the middle of May, because the conference is in the middle of September. That's that 120-day window that we were talking about. And there is a safety valve in the proposed policy that the executive director must review anything before it's signed. So there is an opportunity for the executive director to consider these organizations and what their track records are. I would just say that there was a lot of passionate debate. And people we worked very hard to find something that we felt like was reasonable, middle of the road in a sense, but also dealt with the concerns that had been brought the previous 2 years, while still extending plenty of opportunities to go out there and seek sponsors. I think there's an opportunity for the board to put the lid back on a can of worms that was opened with this policy. And if there are substantive changes, as you saw in the memo, the task force would like to be part of that process. Thank you.
I saw Matt Hall's hand and then Lauren Bartlett.
I guess I would just reiterate that, Mike, the language that you're concerned about doesn't include the word harm, to be specific. It includes words promotes or supports acts against journalism. Now, promote is an active concept. It's not a passive one, which if you're going to argue about, and the task force discussed this specifically, whether we should kind of mention Google and Facebook and others, and decided we didn't want to get into specific names. But I would counter that any policy is going to ultimately have to be implemented by the people on the board. And so it's ultimately a judgment call by those on the board on what to do. Taking a step back, I would say I joined this committee because I feel passionately about getting this sponsorship policy right. This board has not done a good job of easing the concerns of its members. And those members include some very large chapters who can easily come to the next EIJ and raise their concerns. I humbly suggest and would request that the board consider adopting this policy as is. When I jumped into it, I wasn't sure that we'd get a compromise. I wasn't sure that we would find something that 5 members could support, let alone 9. I think I'm going off memory that we had 9 members there, right? So my point is, that's correct. So we easily could have had 2 proposals emerge from this, and then they're throwing it back to the board and say, you know what, you guys decide. Because we had people who, like Andy and I, are really kind of leery of limiting sponsors. I would suggest, and I want to speak for Andy, but personally, I think that we limit our sponsors at our peril in this day and age, because we need sponsors to make EIJ succeed. And we'll talk about that in the budget. But we also had members from some of our largest chapters who were dead set against taking any money from Coke, to name one. And I think this policy is pretty amazingly got all of those disparate views to turn into one point of view, which is, yeah, we have to limit some sponsors. To Bob Becker's point, Coke, we cannot take Coke money because of this policy now. We can't. You know what? And that's fine. And if Coke wants a partner with Pointer, and another journalism organization and another journalism conference wants to take their money, then they can and should. But our members have told us pretty loud and clear that they don't want that. I would argue that Sinclair and Fox do not fall under the limitations in this policy. Some board members may disagree. I would fight that tooth and nail. And I think taking money from media groups is important. But I guess I want to pick apart the policies. I want to let others decide, because I'm curious to hear what others think about it. But I would just, because Mike went first and urged everyone to reject this and said he cannot support it, I would just caution, urge a note of caution and kind of level-headedness, and say that this proposal goes a long way to easing the concerns of many members and would take this controversy off of our plates. And I think that there's a wisdom to acknowledging that and to telling our members that we hear you and we're going to take some action to that extent.
For the record, I said I don't support it. I didn't say others shouldn't support it.
No, and that's what I said.
Level-headed argument.
Yeah, that's what I said.
All right, thank you. Lauren Bartlett.
Thanks, Patty. I share a lot of the concerns that Mike raised, but as one of the co-authors of the resolution that was approved by the delegates, I have a process question, and because Andy is parliamentarian also was part of the committee, I'm hoping Bob Becker as the bylaws committee chair could weigh in. And my understanding is that the delegates are the supreme body of this organization. And so if the resolution approved by the delegates asks for a specific task, the task force does not have the right to broaden it and add other things. So I'm concerned about anything, this applying to anything beyond national convention. And I'd really like to know what Bob's thoughts are on that.
If that means I'm recognized, this isn't a bylaws issue. It's a policy issue. You know, the convention certainly can say what it wants to say. So the delegates can do that. But, you know, I guess it comes down to, can it enforce a policy with regard to chapter programs? And I don't think it can do that. The chapters would have to make their own policies. Okay. But it certainly could, I think, say so. The regional conferences, to the extent that they operate under the auspices of national, then probably would be subject to a national policy.
Thanks, Bob.
It's not a bylaws issue.
Okay, so in that case, I can't support anything that goes beyond the scope of the motion that was adopted by the delegates, because it was for a very specific event, the National Convention, and unless this gets changed and removes other activities, I can't support it.
Before we take other questions, I also have a point of clarification. It's my memory telling me that what the delegates passed in San Antonio was to bring something before the delegates at EIJ 20 for action. And so while it is perfectly fine for the task force to come to us and ask the board to consider what they're moving forward with, it's really, if I'm remembering the wording of the what passed last year, the end result is something that your task force would be bringing to the delegates. Can somebody correct me? Is that a correct memory of how that worked? Andy Schatz, please.
Patty, I think you are correct about that. That's something that we talked about procedurally, what happens now. And to me, I think the exact wording leaves it open-ended. What it says in the resolution is to study the issue, recommend changes. Those recommendations will be considered by the board. That's the language. That does not say shall approve, shall vote on. So this could just be a formality as a pass-through. And then it says, and shared with all SPJ members at least 120 days before. A proposal will be brought before the delegates at the next closing business meeting. So you could look at it in different ways. What if the board decided to vote this down? What does that mean? I don't know that it means anything, because a proposal will be brought before the delegates could mean it just goes directly to the delegates, or it could be interpreted as now the board tears it apart and does something else and sends that. So I think it's pretty vague. If I could just, while I have the floor, just add a couple of other points. As Matt said, I came into this very skeptical about what we might do, but I felt it was important to have a wide range of opinions. You know, frankly, Robert from Chicago and I are almost 180 degrees on some of these issues. But where we came together and what I was comfortable with is leaving this as an interpretational guide. So I would actually challenge Matt's statement that this means the Charles Koch Institute is no longer eligible for a sponsorship. I actually disagree with that. And I know that other members of the task force might not like that idea because that may have been part of the point, but I look at it all along as, do you have a track record of supporting journalism? And it's just that narrow part of this institute. And so, you know, I could easily see somebody saying, yeah, they do have a track record. I know it's not popular, but they're a sponsor again. But what I like is the idea of we, as a board, would interpret how these things are to be carried out. Some will disagree and they might get voted out of office if they make the wrong decisions.
Narissa, please.
Thank you. Just a point of clarification. When we sent out surveys, the issue of Facebook was raised in the responses to those surveys and became a conversation that the task force had as a result of looking at the responses of those surveys. So the members raised the Facebook issue first.
Other comments? Thank you. Yvette Walker.
There's been some chat in the chat room about the demographics of the group, or I guess who came up with this idea. I think it's interesting, and perhaps those people would like to raise those questions. I don't know. I think there seems to be perhaps an idea that 40 and younger might not agree or might not think about it the same way. Again, I don't know that's true, but I see it in the chat and I think it's kind of an interesting thing. Someone might want to raise that since they've been talking about it in the chat.
Matt Hall.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think the data that we got, Becky Talent is, you know, a wizard, and she would be the first to tell you that it's not statistically, I don't know, reliable, for lack of a better word. We didn't get enough responses to really rely heavily on that. But I would say that you know, anecdotally, my experience is that younger journalists don't want to take Koch money, just to keep, not to keep picking on Koch. They don't want to take money. They're more inclined to be advocates, and they don't see, as older journalists do, you know, kind of a more restraint. And I think that's, you know, if anyone wants to disagree with that, I'm happy to have that conversation. But generally speaking, I think that's the case. And we just talked a little bit about membership and getting younger journalists. I think this is a legitimate concern that we need to listen to. And I think, I forget who said it, might have been Andy, you know, whatever this board does, obviously it's the board's prerogative, and the board should put a policy that it can feel comfortable with to EIJ. But if it's something that's markedly different from this, I can easily envision a Robert or a Joel or a Colin just taking this exact policy to the convention and saying, well, no, members support this. So I just think that's something that we should all be mindful of. Does that answer your question, Yvette? Okay.
Right. Before Narissa chimes in again, do we have any other board members? Erica, you made a point in the chat field that maybe you'd like to make to folks who maybe aren't looking at that. Do you know how to unmute yourself? There's a microphone icon at the bottom. Chime in if you can figure out how to.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, just from a student perspective, when trying to appeal to younger members, I think we definitely have to be careful. I think not so much with media members as Fox, but even just, you know, at the EIJ conference with board members from our chapter at DePaul, there was talk about the Koch brothers in general, because I mean, just environmental coverage in general as a sector of journalism is growing. And I think those are also people who we would want, you know, as members. And so I think we definitely have to be careful and also look at their history in terms of what they have said about press coverage of their actions. So I think just in general, when trying to appeal to these younger members, that's just a huge growing issue that has to be considered more carefully than I think media groups like Fox.
All right. Narissa, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, just what I hope is a point of clarification. We have much discussion about our wording, and I think we wanted it to be content neutral so that, you know, we're not, to use a First Amendment term, and that's why we shaped our wording based on SPJ's mission statement, that the policy should be in line with SPJ's mission statement. And this draft is also in line with the policy that governs the items that go in the goodie bags. So it's a complement to that as well.
Other input?
This is Tess.
Yes, go ahead, please.
So I think I'm probably in the minority of young people, but I don't have a problem with sponsorships like the Koch brothers, because sponsorships like that make it less costly to have conventions like this. Like I said, I'm probably in the minority as a young person who's okay taking their money, but I do want that said that not all young people don't want this money. I'm sure there's more out there like me, but like I said, probably the minority.
Very good. I'm going to go with board members first, Andy, if you don't mind. I saw Yvette first and then Rebecca.
So I'm just trying to formulate this. So I think where we have run into a problem is we have perhaps some vague guidelines that people do interpret differently, and then other people, such as our membership, interpret that differently. To Tessa's point, taking money for good programming, not a bad thing, but where I think we run into issues is where some people believe that there's a perception issue, that they have, they weigh in on that program, they have some kind of, some kind of way to make a difference, or some kind of way to make changes in the programming that we have. And I know we have said, no, that's not true. We have said, no, the contract does not say that, but I think that there's still perception. So whatever we come up with, whatever we do, and I think having it content neutral is probably going to make the most sense, because if we identify different organizations, those organizations are going to change over time, So whatever we do, we're going to have a level of trust. And I know that's something that we continue to talk about, with this organization. But if we decide to take money from anybody, there has to be a level of trust where we say we're taking money for good programming. It doesn't mean, this or that. And I think that is where we have had an issue, where there was perception that whoever was giving money had a say in what was going to happen, even though we said, no, that's not true. I think we will continue to run into that unless we can figure out a way to very plainly make it clear, and there's that level of trust. Whether or not you believe in taking money from Coke or whoever, if we take money from anybody, there's going to be a perception. We ran into that last time. I think we run into it in the future, no matter what kind of guideline we have. So I think we need to continue to ask for that level of trust and make it clear just exactly what the organization can and cannot do for the money that we take.
Rebecca and then Matt Hall.
So I think what we should not do is generalize young people. My son happens to be here. He's 23 years old. He's a producer at the CBS station here in Dallas. And I just asked him, would it bother you for the Koch brothers to be a sponsor of the conference? And he just said, well, you have to take into consideration their bias. But on the other hand, it wouldn't bother him. And again, he's a 23-year-old producer. who it wouldn't bother him as long as the Koch brothers don't tell us what to do. So again, we can't generalize young people. I mean, here's, my son who's young and he's got his ideas. I think if we really want to know what these young people are thinking, we do a survey. And again, put it out there like, on journalism organizations. Your thoughts on the Koch brothers or anybody else sponsoring, sponsoring a conference, taking part in it. Let's hear from them. Let's not generalize. That's my comment.
Thank you. Matt Hall, then Lauren, and then we'll go to Andy after Lauren. Unmute, Matt.
Sorry. I just wanted to point out to Yvette and others that the policy, we discussed this, we went into great detail about this in our discussions as well, and ultimately decided that people who give us money could propose program ideas, but not panelists or speakers. You'll see the language in there. I know we got kind of hung up on the limitations, but the policy is pretty comprehensive in my view, and also talks about whether they should get speaking fees or expenses covered. And you can see the language there. And I think Rebecca raises a good point that we shouldn't paint any group with a broad brush. I will note that we did do a survey and we heard back from people and, the taking money from groups that don't align with our mission and our ethics was one of the big responses. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to create a policy that really dovetailed our financial obligations with our mission. And that's why you see ethics and diversity called out pretty high.
Lauren.
So a few different thoughts. One of them has to do with input from our members, regardless of their demographic, age, or otherwise. And now that we have John here, and because we had a survey that was not very well responded to, and quite honestly, I believe that the questions could have been written in a more objective way. The fact that we have somebody at headquarters who could maybe shepherd that through, maybe to get the ideas of the concepts that the task force would want to get feedback on, and then have them written in a more neutral way that might generate more feedback and a greater response to the survey, we might be able to have some data that we can use, because to the point that Becky Talent made, what we have is just really anecdotal information because we didn't get enough responses. So to be able to get more feedback from the members. And again, as a co-sponsor of the resolution, I would like to ask the task force in going back and working on this to focus on what it was the resolution was about, which was the national convention and not all other activities.
All right, we might need a motion on that shortly, but let's continue the conversation, watching the clock and making sure we have time for other agenda items. Back to Narissa.
Just to respond to Tess, the cost of the convention was a major point of discussion, and the amount of money that comes into SPJ headquarters to help fund the other things that SPJ does was also a matter of great concern. We recognize that, and I think that's one reason why we agreed to make it broad-based for media and non-media companies. And I would just ask a question on a point of order. Does the board have the authority to say, go back, to use an expression from the farm, and lick your calf over when the resolution said, bring it to the delegates, let the delegates do whatever they will?
I would just respond to that, Narissa, by saying you've brought it to the board, and so now it is a board conversation, and the earlier wording said board consideration. Somebody remind me, I don't have that in front of. So yes. I think this is just giving you at least some board reaction, and we'll see when we finish our conversation here if anybody feels moved to make a motion one way or another. And while I have the floor, I just want to ask another question, and that's to the mechanics of how evaluation of potential sponsors would be carried out. So the line in your draft here says, the executive director will review each contract before it's accepted. That's pretty much what we've done. and just in terms of explaining how this actually has played out in reality, we have somebody who sells our sponsorships for EIJ. We contract with that individual. That individual, her name is Holly Rose. She works for an association that does this for a living. She has a target list of various people she goes back to every year. She adds names, she takes off names, and so on and so forth. The president of the board, the executive director, and whoever else the executive director wants to have involved in that conversation is part of that. And those calls are actually going to begin pretty soon for EIJ 20, right? And it's been my position all along that that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where the real decisions get made. And it's a very small number of people who have a say in the end, right? The board presidents that you've elected, and the headquarters, our executive director, and a few other folks. So, and I'll just give you an example. Last year, we did have the Koch organization co-sponsored with Pointer, and that was disclosed, and everybody who was at EIJ who cares about such matters, they were aware of that. But it was only sometime this fall that I learned that none of those dollars went to SPJ. That entire Pointer/Koch relationship was all to underwrite a RTDNA event for scholarships for students, some kind of new event that they had. They went to Koch/Pointer, or Pointer/Koch, and asked for those dollars to go in that direction. And I asked the folks, our friends at RTDNA, was that purposeful? Did you cut SPJ out of that because of previous complaints about Koch participating? And I didn't get a straight answer, but it's my belief. I interpreted the answer I got as, yeah, pretty much, right? So again, just to make the point, the real decision-making is in what I just described on these calls where a certain sponsor has come forward and all of us on the call says, hey, sounds great, or not so much, right? So if your task force feels like there should be a different kind of procedure, it would be good to consider that. If you feel like the line that says the executive director will review each contract before it's accepted, if you feel as though that's sufficient, okay. But I'm saying that leaves a lot on the executive director. Are we to expect that he's going to do a deep research job on everybody on the list of sponsors and make sure that they're all in good stead versus our criteria here? So I just, in terms of actually implementation, the reality of how the decision-making is made right now and the reality of how it could be, those are some things that I would ask for more information on. I'll let Narissa respond and then back to Matt Hall. And I'm sorry, Andy, Narissa, then Andy, then Matt Hall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There is, I'm not against RTDNA and partner organizations. And if you look at the survey results, that was one thing that was pretty consistent in both surveys, the idea of partnering with other organizations. The problem here is RTDNA called an audible that reflected poorly on us. And that is one reason why we extended the domain to include collaborating and partnership organizations, that if they're not willing to sign on to the same ideas that we uphold in our mission, there can be problems for our organization. And so it looked like SPJ was being the spoiler for the criticisms that were leveled. We were also concerned about how our members who work for Fox, Sinclair, and other organizations felt after this brouhaha was made. So again, those were some of the reasons for expanding the reach beyond the resolution is, you can still get hit by the cow pile even if you weren't the original target of the person throwing it. And so all of these things came to bear in our conversations. We would expect procedurally that the executive director is going to be working with and keeping the board updated on those contracts as they are coming in. Further, we recognize that work probably has already begun on contracts for Washington, recognizing that the existing policy is in effect until there's a vote of the delegates to change that, which would, if whatever is approved gets approved in Washington, that would not take effect till, January 1 of 2021 as we begin to look at new partnerships, or after the convention, mid-September, at that point on, then as we're looking at signing contracts. We are not trying to usurp the process in terms of the bylaws and how the board makes decisions. We're trying to give the board as specific information as we can that's content neutral to guide them in making those decisions. I don't think we expect John to, start a website, ferret out the truth about the dirty dozen. Me personally, I don't care if the space people come back. The ones who were there every year, several years ago, and believed in aliens. Hey, if they pay their money, come on down. But I'm not really sure that enhances SPJ's mission. Thank you.
Andy Schatz.
Okay, 4 things very quickly. About the executive director being involved, I did not see it as punting to the executive director. I saw that as a stopgap. I would feel comfortable knowing that after all is said and done, everything's been reviewed, the executive director comes in and also takes a look. That's how I saw it. As far as Coke, I think this is really important, and we just see evidence of it right here on this call about getting information correct and accurate. It is not the Koch brothers who were a sponsor for EIJ. And if you thought that, I understand why you're upset. It is the Charles Koch Institute. It is a 501c3, it is a nonprofit, it is nonpartisan, and it has a history of supporting journalism. Now, for some people, that's too much to swallow. The name Koch automatically poisons it, but that's not how I feel. I think the facts matter there. Number 3, I think for background, it's important for people to understand that there was division within this task force about going beyond the mission of sponsorship for EIJ. It did not say that in the resolution. You saw the reasoning for why it was there, but there were some people that voted against broadening that. Matt and I both voted no. And the thinking was that this now gets into our partnership negotiations. If anybody was on the board who remembers how tough it was to get SPJ and RTDNA to agree on the same sponsorship policy, 2 particular points were enough to kill that if we had held to our beliefs. So we caved and we allowed that joint policy to be in place. If we are to now stand firm and say there is nothing that can usurp what we have just passed, we have to be ready for RTDNA and others to say, nope, that doesn't match us, and we walk away and we have no conference partners. And maybe that's okay if ethics takes precedence over everything, but it needs to be a consideration. And 4, just quickly, there were some people who, Patty, if you could recap the sponsorship you just described that RTDNA cut SPJ out of something. I don't know that we all followed that.
Right, so one of the sponsors for EIJ 19 was Pointer/Koch. After the fact, I asked about that, and I learned that SPJ did not receive any of that $15,000. That all went to an RTDNA sponsor, a scholarship event. They brought that idea to those sponsors and they were given a green light on it, and that's how it went forward. That piece of information never came to this board. I was unaware of it. I don't know why it didn't come to this board, but it didn't. We were not aware of that. And so anybody who complained about that particular sponsor in EIJ, I wouldn't have been able to give them any information on it. I would not have been able to give them accurate information on that. All right, do we have other input? Matt Hall. Mute.
Sorry, I wrote this in the chat earlier, but just want to reiterate here. I sent a version of this, pretty final version of this, to John before the task force voted, and he said that HQ would be able to handle it. And like Andy said, I view that line more as a backstop. Like it's the last line of defense before SPJ has egg on its face. And to Taylor's question earlier about how active should SPJ involved in this, ultimately the responsibility falls on the board, so the board can do whatever it chooses, whether designate the president to make sure the contracts follow the policy, working group, some other delegate. But yeah, it's ultimately the board's responsibility. And I would say this has been a very good conversation. I'm glad we're having it. Ultimately, this board is going to have to decide, you know, how to handle walking into a lion's den in EIJ 20 on this issue. And I've heard from Lauren, you know, that she thinks the policy goes too far. And I think Andy kind of articulated our thought process on that. And I heard from Mike that he's worried that the Facebooks and Googles of the world might be excluded. And I can tell you that I would not, as Facebook and Google are currently constituted, apply this policy to them. I would take their money gladly. And I think most reasonable SPJ board members would, who are paying attention in the industry. But I wanted just to ask other board members who maybe haven't said which items trouble them in the policy or whether the policy is okay with them. And so I would just ask that we ask that of other board members, and that if we're going to take a vote on this, you know, that we consider either voting on the policy as is, so we get a sense after discussion whether it's a yay or a nay, or maybe punting this to a subsequent meeting where we can go through the policy, and if the board doesn't agree with items, that we then fine tune it. Because if the response of this board is to kick this back to the task force and say do better, that's your prerogative. But as a board member and as a task force member, that's going to be a bad look, because it was, I just want to reiterate, it was very hard to get to the place that we got. And people may disagree about it, and that's fine. Let's work out those issues here, rather than sending it back to a task force that, you know, that tried.
Supported this unanimously.
Correct, which I think is a point that should be emphasized. Narissa, do you have anything you want to add on that point? I mean.
Yeah, it was a unanimous vote. So if it goes back to the task force, it's going to be very difficult to come up with something else, because we all supported this.
I want to offer two additional pieces of information that might be pertinent here. First of all, after EIJ 19, we had discussions with RTD&A as to the operating procedures for 2020, and we reached some agreements among them to schedule our programming separately. That was one of the big decisions. And another part of the new agreement with RTD&A was to have total control on our sponsorships individually. So we could say no to someone under this new proposed policy. They could still say yes. We've agreed that we're going to have unilateral decision-making in that regard. So it could still get messy, is what I'm saying, right? If money is on the table and we go, nope, we don't want that money, they might go, okay, we'll have it. And then still the person who comes to an EIJ doesn't know the difference unless we make unless we're very clear, unless we disclose in some way that you know, these dollars did not come to this group, but to this group only. So that's one point I would make. And then the other, just kind of following up as I think about the actual implementation of anything, we have made some changes in EIJ board involvement. We do have a programming committee this year for the first time. And so while it's just looking at programming, it certainly can weigh in on this particular topic. Additionally, Matt and I will both be on the calls that involve sponsorship questions, along with John and whoever else from headquarters he wants on those calls. So there is at least wider board knowledge. And I think, you know, because we've had this conversation so often over the last 2 years, I think all of us have our antenna up and we're paying much closer attention than maybe board leadership of the past. Do we have, John, thank you, join us.
Yeah, just to reiterate sort of, or expand on what Matt said about where I think staff plays a role here. As I read this policy, it is definitely that there's two sort of phases to this, right? There's the decision to go with somebody, and then there's the actual contractual relationship you have once that decision is arrived to. And I view this more as the executive director is reviewing that final contractual element and having a review process on that before it's agreed to. That the decision to go with or not go with someone would be a collaborative decision between likely myself, any other staff that's relevant, but the board as well, to also respond to a question in the chat box about does the board play a role here. And I, especially in this time and coming off of, it sounds like some controversy last year, I think we would be extra careful to check in on every relationship and every sponsorship we do. So it could be a good year to learn a process to make sure that we feel comfortable with that as well as we go along. I would say at this point, staff is not going to approve any sponsorship without board input. We don't want to get caught that way, and we wouldn't likely anyway, but that's just, we wouldn't get in the habit of that.
Thank you. Let's see, Taylor next, please.
Can you guys give me some historical context about how sponsors were chosen in the past? I'm not sure how it happened, and I know that it was brought up in the business session, but any kind of background would be helpful.
Well, I'll start, and then others who have additional information. We have been partners in EIJ with RTDNA for 10 years. Over some of those years, we've had a third partner, NAHJ, NAAJ. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering all the partners, but we've had various partners, but the through partner, the consistent partner has always been RTDNA. And it's my belief that during this entire time, we have had this outside sales agent who has sold the various financial opportunities. So that includes sponsors, and there's a bunch of different ways for someone to sponsor. You can just outright give money. You can sponsor the bags. You can be you can sponsor the EIJ app, right? There's a bunch of different opportunities that Holly puts in front of potential sponsors, and they all have a different price point. She actually has a prospectus that has the dollar amounts and so on and so forth. It's a confidential document, so it's not something we can share with the board. A sponsor can put up money that way. Additionally, we raise money from exhibitors. That's folks who come to the exhibit floor and buy a booth, and they have a different kind of relationship with us. So that pretty much does that. And then in terms of controversy or pushback, in the summer of 2000, somebody help me here, 2018, is that when we learned for the first time that we had some member concern about sponsorship? 18, I believe, right? So, and that made us go back and review what is our policy on sponsorships. And we found that we had old policy that really wasn't applicable. It was written before we had EIJs. And so basically we haven't resolved this with any permanence. We've kind of taken stopgap measures to address concerns as they've come up, but we're continuing to talk about it now. Does that help, Taylor?
Yeah.
Do we have any other discussion? Lauren Bartlett?
Thanks, Patty. I think that I wanted to follow up on one point that Matt made in his suggestion that maybe we take this up at a future meeting and go through it point by point to give board members time to review it, analyze it. If we have questions for the task force, we can get it. If there's new board members who want additional background on the issue, they have time to research it and talk to current and former board members about it. And that way we can act in a more effective way on it.
I'm sorry, I missed just the beginning of what you suggested, Lauren.
That we discussed this at a future board meeting to give us time to review and analyze and ask questions and talk about it. And for the people who aren't as familiar with the issue to be brought up more up to speed.
All right, so you're suggesting that we take no action today, but consider it in April or thereafter.
Correct.
Okay. Any reaction to that or additional discussion? Rebecca?
I agree with Lauren.
Okay. At this point, I don't think that requires a vote because unless Lauren, you're suggesting a motion here?
I don't think we need to because there's no action item before us. There's no motion before us. I think we can just move on. Is that right, Andy?
Unless
Correct.
anybody is compelled to make a motion. Matt Hall, I see your hand.
I'll defer to Andy if he was going to weigh in there, but I was just going to say, thank you, Lauren. I agree. I think that's the best course of action here. But my question is, April's already getting pretty crowded.
We can do it at the June meeting.
So yeah, I would just suggest that we kind of get a sense on when. We don't kind of pigeonhole it into April if we don't need to, but we just pick a time where we can devote some time to it, being mindful of our deadline.
All right, Narissa, last word.
Mid-May is the 120-day cutoff for it to be out to members.
All right, so that then does require us as a board to take it up in April unless we want to schedule a special meeting for just this topic after that so that we can adhere to that deadline. If there's no motion, we will thank Narissa and the task force for their very careful discernment of the topic. There are many sticky matters, and we really appreciate the amount of care and consideration you gave to all the various aspects of this topic. Thank you. And now returning to our agenda, we are on to the first quarter report. This is on page 136 in your packet. John and Jake Koenig, who is our controller, prepared the memo for us and put forth the tables for us. And John, if we can turn it over to you to give us a short narration on where we stand at the end of the first quarter of the current fiscal year, which is FY 2020.
Thanks, Patty. So the report, just make sure you take a good look at that. I think it's pretty well explained, sort of how we stand, but just to highlight a couple of things. In the first quarter, we showed that we were off by roughly $89,000, just less than that, on budget. A couple things to keep in mind. Quarter one is always going to be a little bit more, you got to take with a grain of salt because it is only the first 3 months of the fiscal year. So a lot of things that are planned for haven't necessarily come to fruition yet through the course of the whole year. So obviously the first quarter is going to be a little bit more difficult to make full analysis on our where we stand. Secondly, what I'm learning is that we are challenged as an organization in that one of our biggest revenue sources as well as expenditure items, being EIJ, happens right after the completion of a fiscal year, meaning some of that revenue comes in during one fiscal year, some of those expenditures happen during one fiscal year, and then more happen in the ongoing next fiscal year. So accounting on convention can sometimes be a challenge, and we are not yet complete as far as our full accounting of EIJ 19 yet. And so that's just something to keep in mind as well. Even though quarter one shows a surplus, as we finish paying expenses that were incurred in quarter two, that will give us a more complete picture. And then lastly, just to kind of highlight one element is that we do have association management clients. Currently, those are two clients, JAWS and ASNE. And we are moving forward. We had to do quite a bit of work to catch up on some of those relationships. And that has impacted the time that we've had to spend on financials to this degree, as well as some of the revenue that some of those association partners would provide us. But we are set to collect on some of those revenue pieces so that we can show more, and that will help defray some of that deficit that we're showing at this point. So other than that, Jake is also joining us today, our controller. That may be something that happens regularly on board meetings, but especially today because I'm still getting to know our finances. So, but we'll take any questions that you have and try our best to answer them, and whether today or even beyond today, to make sure you're comfortable with what you're seeing here. So,
I'd like to give some context as well before we go to questions. So the Finance Committee had a meeting with John and Jake online last week. And this is the first time we were seeing the deficit position for the first quarter. I think the board knows, but anybody else on this call, that we had a deficit position for fiscal 19. We ended with a negative 213,000. That was not happy news at all. We were able to cover that with our reserves. We have sufficient reserves, what's also known as a rainy day fund, to absorb that. But now here at the end of the first quarter, we are absorbing another 89 out of our reserves. So I'll ask Jake maybe to address that in just a second and let us know where do we stand then in terms of reserves. So, John has been on the job less than 2 months, and he is a very quick study, but he can't fix what was left to him, right? And budgets, keep in mind, the document you're seeing for first quarter is the reality, the real numbers versus the projected numbers, right? And so John has inherited a budget that I think was flawed from the get-go. And a year ago, April, when we looked at that budget, we told staff we thought it was a flawed budget. We didn't think it was a realistic budget. And then it was never changed, right? It was presented in April. We lost our executive director a couple of weeks later, and there was never any corrective measures taken to revise what the committee at that point believed was a unrealistic budget. And so the numbers that we saw for the end of the fiscal year last year and the first quarter of this year reflect that we were dealing with a budget that was not very realistic. Okay, so keep that in mind. At the same time, we need to do better on some key areas of both revenue and expenses. There's no denying that. We need more membership revenue. We need more fundraising results. We need to make sure that we collect the dollars due us from partners for whom we do their accounting or other kinds of services. And, as John just said, on that latter point, we will be getting some dollars in soon now that some significant work has been completed. So I just wanted to say that to let everyone on the call know that SPJ's Finance Committee is watching this very carefully. These are surprises that no board should face, right? This is not welcome news. And one of the things that we asked John and Jake to take a look at is the feasibility of revising quarters 3 and 4 for this fiscal year, meaning the budget as written a year ago. Can we revise those so that we actually have a more realistic document as we go into the financial reporting for those 2 quarters, right? So that budgeted to actual does not look so off, right? And that we don't have these big numbers. And so he's going to look at that as a possibility. We're already too far into the second quarter to make any changes in that regard, but before we hit third and fourth quarter reporting, that might be a possibility. And as you see in his memo, dedicated to going into the following fiscal year with a budget that calls for a balance. I would like to say a surplus, but let's just go with the balanced budget at a minimum, right? And so we'll take our first look as a board at that at the April meeting. That's when we typically take up the coming year fiscal report. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to others here, is that among the things that John and Jake are looking at is the possibility of moving to a calendar year, fiscal year, so that we don't have this continued forever problem of not really getting an accurate picture of the financial impact of EIJ, either to our detriment or to our benefit. Right? So if we have a fiscal year that ends on December 31st, we would have a much fuller picture of what our September main event every year looks like. All right, with that, do we have questions? I see Lauren's hand first, and then Matt.
Thanks, Patty. I am really glad you made the point that the budget that we currently have is a flawed budget. I know the Finance Committee felt that way, and I believe other board members, including me, also felt that way. And so I think it's really important for our members to know that. And so what we're dealing with is trying to fix a mess of the past. And I have great confidence in John and Jake and their ability to do that. So I've got 2 questions. One is for Jake for the current budget, and one is for John for going forward for the next year's budget. And the question for Jake is, I think members will see a big number for a deficit, and so they see a number and it scares them. So if you could explain in simple terms what it was and why that wouldn't potentially carry over into the next budget. And then for John, I understand that you're going to be meeting with the Finance Committee ahead of the spring board meeting because in the past, this is my 5th year on the board, not consecutive, but 5th year on the board. April was sort of, it was explained, but it was already done. Changes weren't really made. The operations were going very smoothly, and we weren't having financial problems, so nobody questioned or had time to get information if they had questions. I know the Finance Committee has asked to see the budget in advance of the April meeting, and I'd like that once you've had that meeting with the Finance Committee, that maybe we as a board could review it in advance as well, so that the first time we see it isn't the board packet for April.
Well, Lauren, this is Jake. Could you repeat the question that you had for me relative to the budget?
Sure. So people will see the deficit number and it's scary. And so if you could explain what the main contributions are to the deficit and why we attribute it to that particular fiscal year as opposed to something that we might be concerned about carrying forward into the same problems into future years.
Well, I think as what Patty had spoken about just a minute ago is that John and I are going to do a revision of the actual budget based upon actual staffing, actual revenues from contributions that we think are more realistic to bring in, so that we have a good picture of where we're at. But that's one issue, is putting together the budget to see what our next 6-month forecast is going to be, versus whether or not we're going to continue to have a deficit cash flow issue for the immediate future. So what I look at when I'm looking at the budget, and actually, I'm sorry, when I'm looking at like our actual expenditures and revenues, I'm seeing that advertising revenue is right on track. Our interest and dividends are on track. Our membership is slightly over where we're budgeting from, because we, budgeted a smaller amount of membership dues than even the prior year by 3%. And the other issues were, by the time we issue a new report to you in January, we're going to have the full accounting for the convention being done, whether it, whatever year it's in, and but that is going to then address, like I said, the cash flow issues that John is going to be faced with. So I think that as was pointed out in the budget, the contributions that were put in there were pretty excessive for what SPJ had always taken in. But I think that the executive director at the time was planning on getting in big dollars from, foundations and organizations, not that they would increase the individual contributions, 100 times over what it normally would be, but where it is. But I think that that will be something that, John will be looking at, and we'll put into this next 6-month budget, what our historical dollars have been from a contribution standpoint. So we'll try to shore it up. The coming into the current quarter that we're now in will be a good quarter for us, because we'll be realizing awards dollars that come in, and awards is always one of our bread and butter activities. So we've got the membership and we've got awards as our not routine, but like I said, bread and butter contributions and revenue that are coming in for us. So, and at that point, like I said, the convention accounting will be done, and so we'll be able to see a complete picture of everything that's going on.
All right, who had let's see, I think Matt was next. Matt Hall.
Can I quick address Lauren had a
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, right. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, Lauren, we will, So the budgeting process is starting at the staff level, and it seems like, and this seems pretty normal for most associations, but here as well, that staff will start that process, and each of the sort of leaders of each of their areas will take on the process of putting a budget together. I'll review, try to put all the puzzle pieces together to get us to a budget. But as early as possible, yes, the finance committee will be engaged in that process. And then I would like to, as you suggested, I think it would be smart, because it's a pretty hefty lift to try to absorb a budget in a one in-person meeting, to give you enough time to look at that, to ask questions that can be addressed ahead of the meeting before April. And then April is really a time to finalize that. So that would be the goal for sure. We'll try our best to meet that and establish a timeline.
Thank you both.
Very good. Matt Hall.
Two questions. The first is related to the budget and this switch to a calendar year. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'm seeing some nodding heads when you mentioned that earlier. So I think the board would generally agree with that. In terms of process, two questions for you. Do you need a board vote to go ahead and do that? A, and B, because we're going through the process now, would it make sense for you just to start that now, or like, what's the best way to proceed? Because it seems like right now you're saying, I'm going to bring you another off calendar year budget starting in April for you to discuss, which puts off a decision for us to sync up the calendar year with the fiscal year way off into the future. It just seems like there's a wisdom to doing that as soon as possible, because my second question is, what is the status of our EIJ funding? At first I heard that we were going to be coming in at a surplus for EIJ 19, and then more recently it sounds like we're actually losing money on EIJ, or lost money on EIJ 19. So what is the bottom line dollar there first? And then if you could explain the best way to potentially sync up calendar and fiscal year, that'd be great.
Okay. Matt, this is Jake, I'm gonna kind of address that. I mean, I've kind of thought through this because, you know, we're going to be putting together, like you said, a 6-month kind of forecast, then another budget, you know, for the next year. And I mean, ideally, it would be great if we could actually like have a budget for 2020 for the calendar year. And granted, you know, we're already a month into it, but we'd be going through the exact same exercises. We just wouldn't be duplicating them. And then you could see, like I said, a whole picture of it. So, but I would have to check into the logistics of how quickly we could change our year end, because we would obviously have a short year. So say, for instance, our year ended July 31st, 2019, the new one began August 1st. You know, we could conceivably file a short year return from August to December with the Internal Revenue Service, and then make the switch to a calendar year effective 1/1/2020. So I mean, from just a pure logistics standpoint and getting the thing going and getting John up to speed on all the different revenues and expenses that we have in, I would love to begin, you know, doing it right now, to tell you the truth.
And is that legal? Like, can we legally do that?
Well,
I'm going to find out.
I was just going to add, Jake, that according to the policy manual for the board, the fiscal year is identified in there. So it would probably need a board action to change the fiscal year. But I don't know if there's more that would need to be done with other entities such as the IRS and such. Jake might know that.
Yeah, well, like I said, I don't know that about changing year ends, but I would make the phone calls and research this on Monday, so that we could find out, can we cut our year off at 12/31? You know, make the decision to have that be the stopping point of our the fiscal year that we're dealing with. But so what I'll do is I will find out from the Internal Revenue Service, and I will double check with our CPA firm, who I know has done more year-end changes, and confirm whether or not that all can be done.
Yeah, and I would just add, personally, again, I don't know what the other board members felt, we're just discussing this now, but it makes a lot of sense to me, because on that finance committee meeting, I was told we have a $30,000 surplus from EIJ 19, and then, well, wait a second, it's a $30,000 deficit. And the confusion comes in because of the the timing of the budget. So I would just say if we can give you guidance to do that and make that priority number one, I think that that's a wise thing to do, because I do think it's not going to solve our deficit problem, but if it's legal, it'll at least give us the right information so that we can figure out strategies to solve our deficit problem.
Yeah. So like I said, I will find out from the IRS standpoint, what the, what we have to deal with, what the parameters are, if we had to give them advance notice, anything like that. And then I think that everything in the policies and the, bylaws and things like that for SPJ would be a board vote that you could just make.
And Bob Becker, just quick, I don't know if you guys saw the chat room. Bob Becker notes that we need to check in with Indiana and Illinois because of our incorporation status.
Right. Yeah, we're registered in Illinois. So,
John, I think that Matt answered his own question. He asked about the EIJ bottom line. I know that you said earlier that you're still working on that, but do you want to address his question?
So according to budget, we were to lose 30,000 on EIJ. We thought as end of quarter one that it was actually going to be a $30,000 surplus. What we didn't account for was in quarter two, we made a big payment to the hotel for EIJ that is actually going to bring the actual EIJ final likely closer to that budgeted amount, probably even more. And that is something we're just going to have to address and figure out how that took place. And the finance committee actually requested that we do a study of previous EIJ events and how they ran according to profit or loss. And we will do that so that we can get a bigger picture sense of what that event typically does for us and what it can do for us. So more to come on that. We definitely would like to get that event to be something that can support and help our bottom line, not draw from it.
Very good. So does anyone feel compelled to offer a motion supporting the investigation of a change to a fiscal year? I saw Matt's hand first. Matt, would you like to make such a motion?
I would love to make the motion that staff examine and pursue syncing up our fiscal year with the calendar year.
And do we have a second? Lauren is seconding. Is there any further discussion of this suggestion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any nays? Any abstentions? The motion carries, and I really appreciate that. I'm getting feedback. So that we can move with all due haste on that possible solution. If it's legal and can be done quickly, that would be great and would certainly reduce a lot of back and forth and duplicate work at headquarters of trying to draft 2 new quarters while drafting in, et cetera. You get the point. Okay, very good. Thanks for that. And I think it's important as we leave this conversation about the budget that it really does relate to the sponsorship topic in so many ways, right? We need dollars to do EIJ. We want to be wise about our final decision there, even as we think about other revenue sources and to shore up the budget. Next on the agenda.
Quick question on that point.
Yeah.
I was wondering, John, could you tell us when you expect to have a final accounting of EIJ 19?
I'll have Jake contribute if it's different than what I believe, but we would be very close to that. I mean, it would be a matter of just making sure that we as a staff communicate with each other to make sure that we've got all the expenses covered. And then it was close to begin with, and we just got to add in a couple of numbers. Jake, anything to add to that?
No, what I would like to add is that I want to wait until we're able to enter in all the credit card charges for the November and December. I had Kathy stop, like I said, in October so we could get this reports out, and that was, part of this issue. But that way, once we get our credit cards reconciled with the bank statements, then we know that everything's flowing through correctly, and then we can provide that report to you. So we just got done with filing some internal revenue documents that for SPJ, the foundation, our outside clients relating to payroll and independent contractors. So she is now, that is her next highest priority, is to get those credit cards entered in the system. So I would say, that we can have that within a couple weeks time period and do a full accounting for you of the convention. And as a side note, I did, our auditors, we did provide all the information that they needed. They asked additional questions relating to deposits and expenses that occurred while they were up to the point of their field work. And they said that we should have a draft of the audited financials within the next 2 weeks. And what happens there is that I will review that compared to our financial statements, go over any questions. John will look at the draft of the budget or of the audit as well. And then any changes will go back to the auditing firm, and then we'll be able to have a set of draft financials for the year end July 31st, 2019.
All right, thanks very much. Our next agenda item is number 9, update on EIJ 2020 planning. And John, why don't you take the lead there?
So we're excited about EIJ 2020 because we're in Washington, D.C., obviously a real hub of activity in this particular year, especially as an election year. I did a site visit with staff to the hotel property in January, early January, and it's going to be a good site for us. We have a lot of space to utilize. It's a nice location. Those who are familiar with the DC area know that it's a pretty prominent hotel there in Washington. It's a good spot for us to be. The RTD&A partnership is smooth and moving along well in regards to us working together. We are in the midst of probably the biggest things we're focused on right in this moment is sorting through the 90 program proposals we got for workshops and other programming at the event. And just as a highlight for the board and others, we this year will be choosing our programming separately with our RTD&A. So we as SPJ will select our programs. They have a different process for their programs, but we are committed as organizations that to the attendee, it not feel so divisive or divided as far as programming. So if you're an SPJ member, you're certainly allowed to attend a workshop that has been developed and promoted or developed and by RTD&A and vice versa. And so it's more of a process change than what you'll acknowledge or note at the event itself. The other thing we're trying to figure out are our super sessions. We'd like to nail down what those are going to be and try to get speakers and those lined up so that we can use that as a promotional tool. And the other thing that we then will start focusing on is promoting the event and making sure that our members are aware, if they aren't already, of that it's happening and try to encourage attendance. So on that note, I think that'll be the update for now. And Patty's on the programming committee as well. And I think that's, again, the lion's share of the activity at the moment for what we're doing. But open to questions and anything else we can share.
Sue is asking in the chat field whether students or younger members are providing input on the programming. How do we react to that, fellow programming committee members? Is there we've just started the process, Stu. We've just taken up the first 12 program proposals. We'll go through the entire 90. We'll certainly be mindful of having programs that appeal to all ages, a wide variety of members and their interests. But that's a good point to be mindful. Make sure that we have some student-centric or young member-centric kinds of opportunities. Matt.
And I'll just add quickly, having just gone through the strategic focus groups, Sue, with our student members, a lot of that conversation was spent on EIJ and how to make that better, and specifically what kind of panels. So I'm mindful of that as well, and have some ideas. And if they don't show up in the proposals, we'll try to make sure that EIJ 20 reflects those.
Very good. Rebecca?
As your diversity chair, let's be conscious of the diversity, because I don't know how many conferences SPJ I've gone to, and it's all white people at the panels and moderators. So just putting it out there again.
Yep, it's already come up in some of our early conversations, so all good. Taylor.
I would just say that a priority of mine is making sure that the programming is digitally focused and on the focusing on innovative ways to tell stories, because in the past I think that we could have used more of that.
Thank you. Mike Riley sings that from that book as well, and is always mindful of that as we look at proposals. All right, so thanks everybody on that. John, go ahead.
Just real quick, in the chat box, I put in the dates that have been determined for when registration will be open, and staff is working with RTDNA to manage that and make sure that we identify those dates to membership. But whenever you're out somewhere talking with members, make sure you let them know you'll be there and you want to see them there too. I mean, we want this to be one of our highest attended events in recent memory, not only for just the conversation we just had about budget, but just as a sign of energy for our industry and for our membership. So let's do all we can to encourage attendance.
All right, Rebecca last, and then Yvette. Go ahead, Rebecca.
I wanted to let you guys know that NABJ and NHJ is going to be in Washington, D.C. also a few months earlier. So, we're going to run into that because we really want to bring in people from those groups over. And yeah.
Very good. Yvette?
Yeah, just want to encourage us to make sure we are letting this board know as soon as we know who has confirmed or whatever. For example, I know that Mary Louise Kelly from NPR has confirmed because it says so on a press release that we talked about. And I think most of us probably read that press release and saw it. But I mean, I think that we should mention that in meetings like this. It's exciting. Encourage us to kind of let people know that has happened, what's going on. We haven't mentioned that at all in this discussion. I think we probably should have said, hey, don't forget Mary Louise Kelly has confirmed to speak. So we need to do that. We need to continue to just make communication open, even within
I think that's great. And one of my goals is for us to select our fellows early enough that we have them up online way before the early bird deadline. For some reason, that's been a challenge the last couple of years, and that really is not good strategy. All right, so thank you for all of that. And let's move to committee reports. We have first Sue Kopenkachev has a report starting on page 145 about the Awards and Honors Committee. And I hope everybody took a look at that. They have a lot of good things going on. So Sue, anything to add or anything you'd like to highlight for people on the call?
Yeah, a couple of things actually. And Mike Riley, feel free to jump in there. I know Patty, you've put the note out about how we completely overhauled the historic sites location and made it a living, breathing operation. With all due respect, it was a piece of crap before. It was nothing but printed words. It was boring. There was absolutely no reason anybody would want to go there for any information. I had the idea, and Andy helped out. Mike made it come alive. Billy got it up and running, and I think it has been just huge. Mike can address, he's done a good deal of outreach to put the word out, and the feedback has been tremendous. So that has been a big plus. The awards, the Sigma Delta Chi Awards deadline is coming up, and I think in 2 weeks. We'll have a report back on both the MOEs and the SDX entries. I am really excited about the new categories that we've added to the contests. We are trying to make this a fluid, living, breathing thing again to better reflect what is going on in the industry. And I think the categories which we have added will certainly will do that. And it's a huge leap for the contests. And the other thing is, Patty, as you know, I've made a proposal with regard to the fellows. The awards committee and the restructuring of the governance of the organization has turned over the vetting of the fellows, which is a whole different thing. But many of you are probably not aware that in years past, the fellows, when they were selected, were agreed to one obligation of making an appearance. Back then, it was in person to either a national or a local event. That fell by the wayside. I don't remember when, but it was an integral part of that period of time. So I have two proposals with regards to the fellows, and I think it will require action by the board. I think it requires action by the board. The first is that we reinstate that. It seems that we could get a bigger bang for our buck, frankly, an investment in our fellows by making them a part of SPJ in two ways. One, engage them and doing a program, which is much easier now because they never have to leave home, theoretically. They can participate and do it from the comfort of wherever they are. Heck, at the Region 2 conference this past year, the speaker was a former student of mine who's a reporter for the Washington Post, and she Skyped in from Venezuela. So anything is possible. So that's number one. Number two is, I think we have lost an opportunity by not making our fellows lifetime members and having them associated as a member of SPJ. It will give us status. It will give us some significance. It will give us, I think, a little bit more relevance to see the names of people who have been made fellows who are also members. That I think will require some approval. I've talked to a number of people about it. I've talked to John when he met with Andy and I in Washington. I think it's time we start kicking this up a little bit, and I think this is certainly one way to do it.
All right, thank you, Sue. I would also highlight that we had an increase in the number of MOEs. So I don't know if we thank you for that or if it's just a happy occurrence, but the contest revenue is also, necessary for our return to financial health. So is there, Lauren?
I'd like to follow up on Sue's presentation and make a motion. I'd like to move that current and future fellows be made lifetime members of SPJ.
Do you want to roll the other piece of Sue's suggestion?
Sure, and also that as part of the acceptance of becoming an SPJ fellow, that you agree to participate in one SPJ activity, or that they agree to participate in one SPJ activity.
Do we have a second motion?
A second.
I heard Mike Riley first. Thank you. Any additional conversation?
I fourth it.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Thanks very much. I would just say one of the things about the Fellows Program, there's a lot of things we can do to ramp that up, leverage those names, get some big names. Let's not throw out the names on this call because that's a secret deliberation. But also one of the difficulties has been whether we can cover folks who we invite as fellows to come to EIJs free of charge. And again, we come back to the finances, right? Can we do that? Can we not make them pay their own airfare? And, because that's really crappy to invite someone to be honored as a fellow and then saying, well, as long as you can, spend $350 to get on a flight to come, right? So we need to talk about that as well. All right. Thanks very much to Sue and the committee. Some really vigorous activity here early in the SPJ year. Really appreciate that. Moving on to membership. Colin DeVries, not on the call, I don't think. So Colin's membership committee, he has a report starting on page 148. Are there any questions on his report? You see the fruits of his labor in the email that you just got about the SPJ Love campaign, as well as the discounted membership. One decision that went back and forth was whether to include renewals in the membership discount. And ultimately, I vetoed that proposal, and the committee was good-natured about it. Just in talking with John and Caroline in membership, it was just not a really prudent way to go. And so let's see how this new iteration of a discount works. And again, as we talked about earlier, if everybody who is a board member or anybody else on this call can do their part to promote that campaign and see if we can get some good traction, some good numbers on that, that would be most appreciated. Next, we have a report from Paul Fletcher, FOI committee. I don't think Paul is on the call. I would just say that committee likewise has been active and done some great things. One suggestion that came after the board packet was released was doing more to let our members know about such things like our advocacy, our FOI activity, our legal defense fund activity. And so I've already looped back to Jennifer Royer, our communications director, to ask for a conversation on how to get more attention for those, the very good work we do in that realm. And sometimes we forget to tell members and make some noise about things like giving money to members or otherwise joining friend of the court briefs and things of that nature. All right, now last, before we go to public comment, we have Bob Becker on the line who has a proposal in front of us on some bylaw changes. So if we can turn it over to Bob to set that up for us.
Yeah, my report is pretty self-explanatory, and I wish we didn't have to do this. We haven't needed to have it do it in the past until last year when the question came up, what would happen if Michael had ran for president-elect and refused to serve. We created the president-elect position probably sometime in the 90s. And it was intended to connote that you were elected president-elect and then you became president. So we didn't, for 25 years or so, we didn't encounter a problem. But there is the open question about whether, if something happens to the president-elect, what would happen? That position needs to be filled now because the board is now only 9 people, not 23. And so a workload that, Matt has carried a lot of load for this year. If he were suddenly not there, who would pick up the slack? It would be spread across the other 8 people unless a replacement is put in place. At the same time, we don't want to put in a replacement who automatically becomes president because that person may never have been elected to any position in SPJ, as long as they meet all the qualifications. In other words, they were a chapter president, they were a national committee chair, they were something, but they weren't elected to that position, but we don't want them to become president automatically. So that was the issue that we were trying to resolve. And when the committee discussed it, some of the members felt it would be kind of odd to appoint a president-elect and then say that person who is president-elect isn't going to become president, which brings us to what do we call that person in that situation? And the consensus of the committee was, well, we should go back to just calling that person for all time the vice president. And if that person is elected, that person becomes president at the end of the year. If that person is not elected, you're going to have an election for both positions at the end of the year. So that's the main issue that needs to be fixed. The other changes are really pretty minor. The bylaws said that people who are elected serve until the next convention. Well, we also have a provision in the bylaws for having an election in a year when we decide not to hold a convention. There is the possibility that we could go 2 years between conventions if something happened. But we still have an election in that year, at the end of the year, even if we're not having the convention. So saying that the person who's elected serves until the next convention really is wrong. They serve until the next election. And that is the other fix that we had to make. And there was one final minor fix just because we didn't catch it in the restructuring. And it still said something about the vice president for campus chapter affairs and a couple of other things that are hangovers from the old structure of the organization. And that's just a mechanical fix. So those are the amendments we've proposed. As I said, but for what happened last year, I don't think we would have even proposed these things, but we now know that there may be an issue and we presented the board with the language to fix them. It is now up to you to decide what to do with them. And if you decide that we should make these fixes, then they need to be sent to the membership 60 days before the convention. So you've got time.
Right. So are we ready for, do we have some questions?
I've got a question.
Sure.
Bob, so just to clarify, if somebody is elected vice president, they automatically become president. They don't run for president. It's only if somebody is appointed as vice president that they would then have to run for president.
That's correct.
Okay.
The bylaws say, the amendments say an elected vice president succeeds to the presidency at the end of the year, but not if the person is appointed.
Okay, thank you.
And go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to add, Bob, I know I have concerns that I might not be here to finish my term, but eating salads, exercising regularly. I'm feeling pretty good, man. I think I'm going to make it.
Well, you've been acting like Superman, so I figured just, if for some reason your kid decided to go to ballet school in Russia and you decided to move,
that's more likely. Yeah, that's more likely.
Well, unlike Matt, I am not off the coffee or the booze, so I don't know if I'm going to make it to the finish line. However, do we need a motion, Bob, to move this forward?
You could do that. You don't need to do it now. If you want to do it now, you can.
Can I ask one other question?
Yes.
And this is a historic thing, Bob. So remember when Darcy Lunsford was president-elect and she chose to resign from the organization because she became a realtor, and then John Enslin and then Sunny, can you just, I don't remember the details. How did that work? And how would these amendments affect a situation like that?
Was it Darcy Lunsford or was it Sue Porter?
It was Darcy.
Okay. I don't read that.
Darcy, John was the order.
Okay. If the person resigns and the seat becomes vacant, the board.
I'm trying to think. Was she?
See, I don't remember the history clearly enough to comment on what happened then.
I wish I did.
And I don't.
Okay.
I can look at it and come back to you with it, but I can't answer that question now.
Thanks, Bob.
In the interest of time, does anyone feel compelled to make a motion to accept Bob's proposal here to make these language changes in our bylaws? So moved. Do we have a second? Can I have a second? That was Matt Hall seconding. Any additional conversation?
I just have a question. So when we went from vice president to president-elect, why did we make that move? And is there any, is there any reason why we should not go back to that naming convention?
Some history. The latter used to be much longer. We had a secretary, a treasurer, a vice president, and a president once upon a time ago. And the secretary treasurer were combined into one position. And at the same time, I believe, the decision was made, as other organizations had made similar decisions, that the presidency really needs to have some continuity, and it really takes longer. You should learn something before you become president. And so therefore, the president-elect was set up to designate that person would become president after 1 year and serve for a second year as president. So it was sort of conflating the structure, the officer structure of the organization with a goal. I don't think there's, as long as we define the vice presidency as a position that succeeds to the presidency, if the person is elected, I don't think we have a problem with changing the name of the title.
So technically, as long as if we had someone who had to step down, technically, as long as the appointed person who came into that role didn't automatically rise up to president, it doesn't really matter what we call them.
That's correct.
But do we think that calling that appointed person president-elect just gives maybe membership a bad taste? Is that kind of what our thinking is?
I think what the members of my committee, 4 of whom are past presidents of this organization, felt a little uncomfortable with having a person who was designated president-elect and then doesn't succeed to the presidency because they were appointed. So the feeling was among them that we should change the name so we're not, by calling that person president-elect, giving the impression that the person succeeds to the presidency.
Thank you.
All right, Matt Hall, question?
Yeah, just a quick question. So when would the name change take effect? Because we're going to have an election for president-elect and a vice president change. Would it take effect in September or September 22?
Amendments take effect.
21.
Amendments take effect immediately after they are approved by the convention. So, I think changing the name isn't a big issue. We can explain it on the website in the campaigning section, in the election section, that this title is going to change at the beginning of, right?
Okay.
So it's going to go from being president-elect to being vice president. And this is why it's happening, but it's happening now.
And just a point of order, this would be a recommendation by the board to the delegates. The delegates have to make the change because it's a bylaws change, correct?
That's correct. The delegates have to approve the bylaws change.
All right, so where did we stand? Did we have a motion?
Yes.
I'm sorry. And so the discussion is now ended, and now we are voting on the motion to accept Bob's suggestions for language changes to go out to the membership in advance of EIJ with the specified number of days in advance. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, that has passed. And with that, we are now moving into public comment. Thank you so much for those of you who have stayed with us and have been patient. We're 2 hours and 21 minutes into our meeting. We are scheduled to end at 3 board members, but we do have 3 things to take up in executive session. So let's go ahead with public comment. After that, we'll move to executive session. If there's a need for any of you folks to sign off then, let us know. And we'll probably need to take a 5-minute break in between that. So with that said, let us open the floor to public comment. If you'd like to be recognized, please just raise your hand physically. I can see you, unless you don't have your picture on the screen, and then you're going to need to put into the chat field that you'd like me to call on you. The first hand that I saw was Bob Becker.
Thanks, Patty. I want to comment on 2 of the reports, the Strategic Planning Task Force and the Sponsorship Task Force. And it's not about the reports. I think the reports are great. But what I heard in the focus group I was in and saw in the comments from the other focus groups and from responses to the surveys on the strategic planning and from the comments to the survey on sponsorship is that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of a significant number of people in this organization about what this organization is. One of the reasons this organization is so broad and has such great support from the industry is that it includes publishers, executive editors, managing editors, and line reporters and freelancers, all people at all levels of the industry. And my sense from reading a lot of the comments is that there are a significant number of members of SPJ who believe that SPJ is or should be a journalists' union. In other words, it should stand up for the rights of the reporters and other people who create content in relationship to their employers. And that is somewhat, actually not somewhat, really antithetical to the whole approach and principle on which this organization operates. We have steadfastly refused over decades to become involved in the relationship, the employment relationship between reporters and their bosses. And we have done that for good reason, because we have Bill Ketter, we have Howard Dubin, we have lots of people like them in this organization. And the last time we tried doing that by accident, I think, was in 2006, 2007, when SPJ joined an amicus brief in support of the New York Times in a dispute with its freelance writers. And when the freelancers in SPJ learned that we had done that, a bunch of them left. So I think that's a very stark line that we cannot cross. And I think one of the things that we need to do as part of our education process and as part of making this organization work is make it clear who we are and why we are the way we are. And I think it's very important that we maintain that distance between our role as an advocate and an educator and a supporter of journalists all over and at all levels, and getting involved in that relationship. And that is my main comment. I have one other thing I'd like to talk about, and I think some of you will think that I'm a pain in the ass about this because you've already heard it, which is the nominating process is critical to the restructuring of this organization. And part of the nominating process was to have a standing committee from all segments of the organization to screen candidates, which is the screening process should be starting right now. The list of nominating committee members on the website is the list of people Eddie Gallagher recruited a year ago. And a number of them apparently didn't do very much to help her. I think it is, in order for this organization to move forward and really accomplish what the restructuring was intended to accomplish, the nominating committee needs to be stood up and it needs to function as it was intended so that there are contested elections at all levels, and so that you also have people who we know are skilled, who we can put into those 2 appointed positions every year that the board has. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Bob. In this order, Jonathan Make, then Michael Koretsky. If there are others of you who are wanting to speak, it would probably be good for you to put your name in the chat queue so I can do this in an orderly way. Michael Koretsky. I'm sorry, I said Jonathan Make first. Jonathan Make, are you ready? Are you with us? Jonathan Make. Andy, that was your note. If you have him on text, if you would just poke him. And in the meantime, we'll go to Michael Koretsky.
Howdy, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, just a couple quick things about your meeting. First, I read all the comments collected by the Strategic Task Force. I thought that was insightful. I noticed that there was only one program that was named, and that was the fake news trademark program. It was mentioned 3 times, I think, and someone referred to it as brilliant, and that wasn't by anyone that participated in it. That caught my eye because that's one of the first programs I did after leaving the board and trying to use my SPJ time to do stuff. And I believe it was the most publicity SPJ has received in at least a decade. It was 60 media outlets. I mention it because when I brought that to the board, there was some hesitancy to support it. You didn't oppose it. And after the fact, you praised it, which I really do appreciate. But I'm wondering, because if your strategy is going to be going more towards advocacy and outreach and those sort of things, I'm going to suggest that you might have to be more innovative than you're traditionally comfortable with. In fact, the previous program that got you a lot of attention was called SPJ Airplay a few years back that me and Lynn Walsh did, and the board opposed it then and supported it later. And advocacy is not easy. Likewise, Patty attended a college media convention back in October, and she saw an SPJ program that me and Lynn Walsh, your ethics chair, did. And basically, we had lobbyists train student journalists to go to Capitol Hill to lobby on shield law and other First Amendment issues. I want to do that at the EIJ in DC, and Patty and John have told me they support it. What's interesting is when I asked for support from the SPJ First Amendment Forever Fund, the answer was no, even though that fund is defined as lobbying Congress. And again, maybe because it was a little too weird. But here's the thing, that lobby program, you guys were talking about diversity today. I think it's like mentioned 50 times in the agenda. That program was actually ended up being diverse. And I think one of the ways to have diversity is by having interesting programs. So it would just naturally attract diversity. And just one other thing about diversity really quickly. You guys talked about how to get SPJ more diverse. So I have this idea, and I haven't been able to flesh it out, but maybe you guys can. The theory is that SPJ is already diverse. It's just not diverse at a national level. And that's a hypothesis based on incomplete research, because SPJ Florida has 5 people of color, 1 trans man, 2 former diversity fellows. So I asked some other chapter
Michael,
leaders.
your sound has gotten warped and now we've lost you. Michael Koretsky, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back, thanks. We got you through need interesting program to also enhance diversity. We are diverse, but not at the national level.
All right, well, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right, so I was just saying that you know, Patty, that program that you went to had some diversity just because it was interesting. And I'm thinking that as you guys are doing the strategic task force and you try to support advocacy and those kind of interesting programs, I think you're going to find that you're going to be more diverse. SPJ Florida has 5 people of color, 1 trans man, and 2 diversity fellows. I think because we do that programming, and I'm actually have a theory that I'm hoping you guys might be interested in following up for your strategic plan, which is I believe SPJ is already diverse. It's just diverse at a chapter level. I asked informally some chapters about their breakdowns, and the limited results were encouraging. And I'm wondering if your diversity committee or your strategic planning task force actually got a chapter leader census, if you would find that the chapters themselves are led and very diverse, but SPJ nationally is not. And then you'd have to ask the question, why is that? Is it something that we're doing from the way that we run SPJ nationally and not an SPJ wide problem? And the last thing I'll say is just something Bob brought up about SPJ supporting unions. And I have no truck with what SPJ National wants to do, but I know that SPJ Florida, because it is run by, their board has only 1 person over 40 and 5 people under 30. They have taken to supporting unions. So I don't know if Bob was referring to that, but that chapter has been very active in Florida and now elsewhere supporting unions. So I just didn't want to, I don't know what happens if SPJ National doesn't want to do something and a chapter does want to do something. It might be, you know, kind of like a state versus federal government laboratory, you know, learning laboratory. Like, I just hope that no one's going to come down on South Florida and try to tell them that these under 30 people that have decided to do that, that they can no longer do that. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I think we do have Jonathan Make now available. Jonathan, you're on mute. Hi, we can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Okay, I'm not sure what made that happen. Anyway, I'm just going to go one by one with a couple questions. I'm Jonathan Make with SPJDC, and in this role representing the group of chapters and chapter leaders that have advocated on some issues. When we were going over the scripts structure, I kind of got lost on what's happening going forward, other than there'll be fewer of the scripts sessions. Could someone just recap? Maybe there's some background, the funding is less, or there's not going to be as many scripts mini sessions, and then I'll get on with the next question.
I'll start, and then maybe John, you want to backstop me. Scripps is changing its engagement with us. It will be funding an annual program that selects college media leaders. So you're the head of the TV station on your campus or your newspaper on campus, to come together for some immersive training at Scripps headquarters. At least that's the kickoff event in June. So Scripps used to give money to SPJ for the sessions that trained SPJers to be better SPJ leaders, right? So they have decided to change the direction. As to have they changed their dollar amount, we can't share the dollar amount, but John, do you know if the dollar amount has stayed the same?
I believe it stayed the same, yes.
Okay, so that's the answer on that. Next question, Jonathan.
Thanks a lot. We were just curious about the chapter kind of dues remittance situation. It seems like it's mostly caught up, but then I think I read something in some of the handouts that might have contradicted that, and or heard something from some of the chapters. So we just get a very quick recap on where that stands.
I'll give that over to John to answer.
Sure. As of actually early this week, since it was on Monday and we're on Saturday, all the chapter checks were sent out that cover the last 3 quarters of collection. That's not a good practice. We need to be doing that on a quarterly basis, if not more rapidly. So that's one of the things I'm working with staff to ensure happens more regularly and figuring out why it didn't. I do believe it's not that anyone just said, we're not going to do that. It was definitely a technology issue with our current member database solution. And so that's one of the reasons to shift away from the system we're in, but it's something that we need to get better at. But it's as of today, except for one chapter that we're in communication with, those should be fairly caught up, and we'll deal with any variances as they come. If the chapter feels that what they received wasn't a reflection of what they should have received.
So Jonathan,
okay, thank you, John.
Jonathan, for what it's, let me just respond to that. For what it's worth, that was a surprise to those of us on the call this week, learning about that during the Finance Committee meeting. And John is committed, as he just said, to making sure that that doesn't happen again, that we disperse those remittances on a quarterly basis and stay up to date with that, because that's just very bad practice. Next question from you, Jonathan.
Sure, and just to confirm, so this is through the 4th quarter of last calendar year, is that right?
Through the, that's a good question. I assumed it was through the 1st quarter of this current fiscal year, but yep. Now I'm getting myself confused as our calendars. But.
Yeah, John, are you talking about the chapter checks?
Yes, thanks.
It's the 3rd and 4th quarter of the year ending July 31st, 2019, and the 1st quarter of 2020, which basically were caught up through October 31st, and in issuing out chapter checks. And then as a standard procedure, we do that once a quarter. So we'd wait until we got everything collected in, actually now through the end of January, and then issue those checks out in the month of February.
Okay, appreciate it. Thanks. I will just quickly note that about a dozen chapters had previously publicly raised that issue. We were under the impression it was fixed, but I appreciate that you all are going to try and fix it again, so thanks.
It is fixed now.
Okay, so I can let the chapters know that this shouldn't happen again.
Yes, I mean, we're caught up, and like I said, we'll be issuing checks again in February, but again, we're caught up through the 1st quarter of 2020, and the software is doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Okay, one other question and then a couple extremely quick comments. Our group just wants to reiterate that we continue to be kind of extending an invitation to John to, set up probably virtual, to set up a time to just kind of do a Q&A with, this group of 50 or 60 chapter leaders. We kind of see it as a potential extension of the listening tour, John's been on, and so I'll just put that out there. The couple finite comments are, we in DC appreciate that John was just here and had numerous meetings that seemed productive. Also wanted to compliment the packet for this meeting. I think it speaks to the great work that's going on at the committee and the board level and various other levels. It's just really great to see this and to see people pulling in the same direction, moving forward. And finally, also wanted to recognize 2 different staffers, Caroline and Jen, just this week were helpful and quick responding to actually my outreach on behalf of SPJ DC. So very much appreciate that, and that's all. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I believe next we have Sergi, who's joining us from Louisiana. I saw your picture there. Hi there. Sergi, you're very faint, voice-wise. If you can lean in closer to wherever your mic is.
How about now? Do I sound better?
Excellent.
Perfect. Okay, I was in headphones before. Just wanted to say a quick thank you, Patty and Matt, for inviting us to the meeting. Really appreciate that. As most of you are probably aware by now, we had sent a letter expressing our concern in regards to the deficit, and we got some pretty swift and thorough answer from both Patty and Matt, and we appreciate that. We just had a couple of follow-up questions. And I don't know if anyone could answer this. Historically speaking, has SPJ ever faced a deficit of this magnitude before? Not sure if anyone can answer this.
I just saw a nod from Sue Kopen-Kachev, who's probably has the longest tenure on the board. So yes, Sue, we've had deficits in the past, yes?
We have, to the point where when we were headquartered in Chicago, there was a question as to whether the organization would even continue to exist. So it has been much worse than this.
Okay, great. I just wanted to know what the historical perspective on that and whether this is something that we're used to turning around. Because as you said, it is a pretty scary picture when you're not involved in the minutia day to day and not knowing what's going on. So from what I'm hearing, it seems that you guys are addressing the issue. Is this part, are you addressing the deficit as a separate mechanism, or is this just part of the normal operating procedures of the annual audit?
Well, the audit is a separate process, right? So an audit is a backward-looking process, right? They come in and look at the books as they stood at the end of the last fiscal year. The deficit's a forward-looking issue that we have to resolve as we create the next budget. And as I don't know if you were on the entire call, we're urging our headquarters staff to move to a new fiscal year, which we think will help us get a better picture on how to attack the current deficit and prevent future deficits. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that.
You are.
Okay.
And just a quick point of clarification, we read a little bit about past board packets in regards to some of the SPJ clients. We were a little bit confused as to the nature of that. Is that just a reference to SPJ vendors at EIJ? What does that entail when you say SPJ clients? Yeah, there was I believe Jake mentioned there was loss from previous SPJ clients. We were just a little bit confused.
Yes, yeah, and this Jake, I'll address that. So a number of years ago, Joe Skeel was trying to determine, to develop new revenue streams, and he had some relationships with some organizations, including, Patty, am I supposed to mention these names or not?
Well, John earlier mentioned ACES as an example, and our newer, I think we announced that we have a relationship with ASNE, whatever the new name of ASNE is.
Yes. But to answer your question, so we've had a number of different clients where we performed different services for. So some of the services we performed for organizations in the past is maintaining their membership database. Another is doing their back office accounting, and another one is doing meeting management. So we're trying to utilize our staff and our expertise in these areas, and going out to these outside organizations that may be smaller or not have the staff to do it, and offering that service to them. So, because we're basically all going through the same things, but that's what the clients are, is our outside clients.
Okay.
Okay, find out. Just hang on. Let me give you a credit card.
I'm sorry, Jonathan, I think you need to mute yourself. As much as we'd all like your credit card information, I think you probably don't want to share that. Andy,
maybe he's going to make a donation.
If you could text Jonathan to make sure that happens. All right, thank you, Sergi, for those questions. Did you have any others? Do you feel like you got the answers you were looking for?
I did. Thank you so much. And just for just sticking in my 2 cents, I don't have an issue with who our sponsors are in terms of Cook, what have you, as long as they don't compromise our programming. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Are there any other hands up to be heard during public comment? Bob, before I call on you, let me see if anybody else pops their name into the, seeing no other requests. Bob Becker.
Just a point of clarification raised by Michael's question. There's this person sitting, who's on this call, who's sitting about 25 feet from me. And I think she would say SPJ should foster a discussion between publishers and freelancers about how they deal with each other. And I think that's perfectly fine. I think the issue for SPJ becomes if it gets involved in a dispute between reporters and their employers about whether they're being treated fairly, whether they're being paid fairly. If SPJ wants to convene those parties, the publishers, the broadcast station owners, and SPJ to discuss what the principles are under which they might operate and have a discussion, that's fine. But the concern I have is for SPJ to become involved directly in the relationship between both ends of our industry, who are all our members. So that's what I had to say. And as for, Michael raised the question about what happens if the chapters decide to do something different. As I said earlier in the discussion when we were, and I think in response to Lauren, you know, SPJ makes decisions for itself as national. The chapters, most of them are separately incorporated, and they are free to go the way they go. SPJ can't really dictate to them too much, and they may suffer consequences as a result of that, they may not. So that's a decision for chapters to make. But I think certainly at the national level, we have to be careful. Thanks.
All right, so I think that Michael is satisfied with that answer. And Hazel Beckler, are you there and want to be recognized? She put something in chat field, but I don't see her signed on. Hazel Beckler, would you like to?
I'm
there you are. There you are. Yes, you are.
All I said in the chat field is that if you want to talk about freelancers and in particular the debate between freelancers and unions, I would be happy to. And if you don't, I'll be quiet.
I don't think this is the right time to do that, but
Agreed.
as Bob Becker just suggested, taking these kinds of topics up during programming, whether it's EIJ or at the local level, seems perfectly appropriate. And I know that you guys have a lot of programming ideas that are in the hopper for us to look at. So I don't know if that's
Patty,
among
and one of them is by the chair of the freelance community to have a group of people talk specifically about the legislative push around the country right now that is making life very, very difficult for some of our very active freelancers in the freelance community.
Look forward to reading that. And I would just say on this topic, we do from time to time get requests from individual journalists, whether they're members or not, to lay out their set of grievances against an employer. We just had one recently, and we pretty much say this is not the role of SPJ to jump into a dispute between an employee and their employer, right?
But I don't think you'll find any argument from freelancers about that. This is really a societal question. I think the question of whether everybody should have to be an employee for every dollar that they make when they work for someone. And that would pretty much outlaw freelance businesses in general. And I don't think you'll find many freelance journalists who think that's a really good idea.
Thanks, Hazel. Sue Kopen-Kachev has a point.
It's quick. I would really appreciate if we could find a way, since SPJ is doing its own sort of programming for EIJ, if we could dedicate and return to having the opportunity for students to meet as a group to do troubleshooting and idea sharing and all that kind of thing. It was something that I had started when I was just an advisor at large, and then it was extended to the professionals. We ran out of space, we ran out of time. I don't know exactly what happened. It was dropped. I think, and just in thinking about some of the comments that I saw on the survey for the task force, the students specifically have mentioned that over and over and over again at EIJ, and I know my students have. So my request is, please let us try to find a way to reincorporate some period of time for both students to meet and pros to meet, because this is the one opportunity where you can get all of that sort of dynamic together to sort of help each other out. And I'll leave it at that.
Sue, could you send me an email on that, kind of tell me what that looked like in prior years, and then we'll put that into the mix.
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Thank you so much. All right, I see Jennifer's hand, so let's go to Jennifer Ellis, please.
Okay, so I just had a couple questions, maybe comments. So about the clients, I don't know if maybe chapter leaders don't necessarily realize how much time that SPJ headquarters may spend on some of that. So maybe some of the frustration that chapter leaders have about communication, things like that, maybe not realize that staff are spread across that, you know, doing stuff that's SPJ and doing stuff that's for our clients. So there's that. Also, what was I going to say? As far as programming at the conference, maybe that's a place to put some chapter leaders training sessions, since we're not having the scripts leadership. We, you know, at some conferences in the past, we've had a session where chapter leaders could come and talk about programming and ideas and things like that. So maybe that would be a good time to add that back in. There's been times where we haven't had that, or it hasn't really, we either didn't have it or it wasn't on the app where people could see it right away. I think I had something else, but I forget what it was. That's all.
That's good. Those are both two good points, Jennifer. I think that, you know, among the things John's looking at is our roster of outside clients and what's the net benefit to the organization to have those relationships, especially if it's taking away time from managing SPJ affairs. And then in terms of the chapter leadership training, I like that idea. We've also talked about trying to incorporate that at the regional conferences. And if that's going to happen, we should have had this conversation a long time ago, because of course the regionals are pretty well planned, but I've made a note to follow up on that, because we need to not let that drop. And I know it's on John's list. All right, I saw, let's see, Yvette, your hand was up. But if there's anybody else who is not a board member who would like to be heard at this time, if you could make yourself known. Seeing none, Yvette, did you have a response to some question or topic?
And I did. I put it in the chat, but just really quickly, following up on Sue's comment, I agree. If there's more engagement, particularly with the students, many students are able, well, I shouldn't say many, some students are able to go to their colleges and ask for funding to go to EIJ. Sometimes they also go to regional. Usually that's going to be cheaper and easier for them to get to, but they may ask to go to EIJ, and with more engagement of this type, that would be a better argument they can make to their colleges to help fund them to get there, which of course would be good for us too.
Thanks very much. All right, friends, it's almost at 3. And the agenda now calls for us to move into executive session. I'll need a motion to make that happen.
A motion. It's Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca. has motioned.
Second.
And Matt, I saw Matt's hand first. Second, I'm going to executive session. Any discussion?
I'll just say we need to throw the reasons in there. So
Yes.
I say move into executive session for contract
Right, thank you.
and legal.
Thank you. There are three items on our agenda for executive session. Number 12 is partnership agreements, this being only matters that are confidential in terms of dollar figures or contractual relationships. Next is for continued discussion with the board about the data management contract. And again, that's so we can use names and dollars in a discussion there with our executive director that cannot yet be made public. And then we have a legal matter to discuss as number 14. So we have a motion on the table to move into executive session. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, we're going to end the meeting and pause the video here in a second. So I thank everybody who was on the call, whether you spoke or not. Board members will now go into the executive session. I've invited John to stay on the call. Let's see, John, I don't know how we're going to handle the tech matter here. If Jennifer leaves the call, do we lose our connection?
You don't lose the connection. I can make either you or John the administrator, and you can turn the recording back on when you exit executive session.
I will go ahead and be the administrator, and then I would ask my fellow board members to remind me to turn back on the recording when we exit executive session. All right.
One more point of order related to that, Patty.
Yes.
Like we have in the past, put a tweet out when we're going into open session in case we vote on anything in open session so people can come back to the meeting.
We can do that. And again, I would ask you to remind me when we leave executive session, and I'll be happy to put that tweet out there. Rebecca, hand up.
Patty, can we discuss the legal matter first? Because I am an MC tonight at an event in Fort Worth.
Yes,
and that's
we
an
can.
hour away from my house.
We can change the order. That's fine.
Please. Thank you.
All right. We have now voted to move into executive session. And so Jennifer, if you would go ahead and pause the video.
I do have one more request. If someone could make note of when you exit executive session and any votes that are taken. Yeah.
Do I have a volunteer to take notes during this session?
I will. Oh, well, I'm going to leave early, but
well, yeah. Rebecca, you're going to lead the discussion on number 13. Well, whatever it is now. So Matt, thank you. If you could take the notes and then note the time that we, and Bob Becker, we do have to ask you to exit executive session. Thanks very much.
And Patty, you are the host, so you'll have to pause the recording now.
Very good.
And I will leave.
All right, very good. So we have, let's see, who's on a call? 262 number? 262 number is gone. Okay, I am now being I was supposed to have taken a vote. All those in favor of exiting executive session, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? We are back on the record, and unless there's any closing comments, we're simply going to exit here. I think we'll just give it a 30-second pause, though, to see if anybody comes back on the line. We have no votes to record. There are no motions, correct? Board members. We're just going to give it 30 seconds to see if any of our previous board attendees want to hop back on for any reason. Anybody have fun plans for the rest of the day?
I'm looking forward to the Super Bowl tomorrow because my team, the San Francisco 49ers, are playing.
Well, I'm glad they're your team. They're lucky to have you.
This is the best part of the day. I don't know how that could get any better. You mean you guys do fun things other than this?
I meant more fun. Anybody have any more fun today?
Wow.
Yeah. All right. I'm seeing nobody else joining us. And with that, we will say thank you very much.
We need to move to adjourn, Patty.
Thank you. I always need those reminders. Lauren is moving to adjourn. Do we have a second? Taylor, thank you. On the record, wanting to adjourn. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? We are adjourned, and the time, please note, is 4:09 p.m. Thanks all. Take care. See you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.